we're on a learning journey to implement new prescriptions and monitor outcomes in the many diverse forest communities that we have here in Central Appalachia. Over the last year, we've had 2 field-based workshops, one in Maryland and one in Kentucky, and I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces and names from those pop up. And we're excited to explore those same concepts today with you all, with our invited speakers and with participants in breakout sessions. So why are we even concerned about late successional management? It's all about enhancing forest diversity at scale. Each of our organizations has spent significant time investing and planning for forest management that considers forest diversity needs at the landscape scale, such as with dynamic forest restoration blocks, which you see here. This slide shows an example of how we're planning to enhance forest diversity in the Southwest Virginia DFRB. How we plan for structural and age class diversity treatments at the stand scale is informed by the landscape scale needs for each forest community type. And as we've been diving into diversifying our forest, we've recognized that the restoration community has grown a lot in the recent years in our understanding of how to manage for early age classes, but less so for late successional traits, which are lacking in most of the forest community types within our landscape. So our ongoing efforts to explore late successional trait acceleration will hopefully help us close this knowledge gap, help us learn together as partners, and ultimately lead to more diverse and resilient forests. So what is our approach to this learning journey? We'll start with what it's not. We are not going to give you all answers, prescriptions, or final term definitions. That's for you all as practitioners and experts within your landscapes to decide on for yourself. It is not prescribing that all forests should be managed to old growth. And it's not prescribing the same targets for all forest types. For example, we wouldn't prescribe the same prescription or in state for oak forests as we would for a northern hardwood forest. What our approach is learning, exploration, and experimentation together as a community of practice. It's focused on forest community types with less research on mature forest management in the Central Apps. And it's keeping an open mind. As we've had these workshops, we've realized that the different experiences, backgrounds, and organizational cultures and goals all inform what late successional trait acceleration or management means. So where are we focused? You all are largely a Central Appalachian audience, but today you'll hear from speakers from across Appalachia, from the Southern Apps all the way up to New England. This is by design. By consulting expertise from across the Appalachian range, we hope to spread lessons learned and ideas for future learning across geographies. The apps are home to some of the world's greatest hotspots of biodiversity and forest carbon, and represent a vast network of climate resilient and connected lands in the eastern US. So how we manage our forest for maintaining and enhancing diversity matters for both wildlife habitat, forest resiliency, and human communities that thrive both within and downstream from the Appalachians. So here's our agenda today. We have a very full schedule, so we will do our best to stay on time, and I'll do my best to remind speakers when their time is nearing an end. Each presentation will have time for a Q&A, and if you don't have your question answered, you can reach out individually after the webinar to whoever would be the best person to answer your question. We will have breaks throughout, so feel free to use those and we will announce them. Our first presentation will be led by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro. Tony is the director of the University of Vermont Forestry Program. His research interests are centered on evaluating the efficacy of traditional and experimental silvicultural strategies at meeting the increasingly diverse range of forest management objectives on public and private land. His specific research areas include understanding the developmental dynamics and productivity of natural and managed forest systems, particularly within the context of changing global conditions and societal objectives, identifying factors affecting natural regeneration dynamics, and investigating the nature and influence of plant competitive interactions on long-term patterns of tree growth and forest structural development. Tony has also collaborated with TNC on red spruce climate adaptation work. Paul is a professor at UMass Amherst, state extension forester, and co-director of the Family Forest Research Center. His work integrates research and outreach to family forest owners. The goal of this integrated approach is to learn about family forest owners in order to better inform their decisions. He's also interested in silvicultural approaches to increasing forest resiliency. His outreach methods to family forest owners focus heavily on peer learning, social networks, and internet-based tools. He also serves on the board of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition and is the chair of the Massachusetts Forester Licensing Board. So, without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Paul and Tony.
Thanks, Will. Let me get this shared. And thanks everybody for opportunity to present here. As I was talking a little bit with Sarah and Dan prior to starting today, you know, us up here in the north, and just kind of for perspective, Paul and I are both speaking from not Pennsylvania or Tennessee or West Virginia. So our perspectives definitely are going to be influenced from working up here in the Northeast. But, you know, one perspective, you know, we all share is we're very impressed with just the scale of restoration and thinking around biodiversity conservation that's occurring in the Central Appalachian region. And so it's exciting to get to plug in even for a little bit today to talk with you all about this topic and kind of one key piece in those dynamic forest restoration blocks and some of the broader thinking you're all doing in the region. So appreciate the opportunity to do this. And so the way we're going to divide this up is I'm largely going to start out just giving kind of you know, why are we talking about this? I think most of us in the room, you know, have a sense, or on the Zoom have a sense for why we're thinking about old growth, and then really drill in largely the stand scale, thinking about just the silviculture we might be trying to achieve in some of these areas where the goal is to restore some of those old growth conditions that we often are referring to in these late successional habitats. And then Paul will kind of finish this out by thinking more broader scales and how we really look at that diversity of ownerships and kind of values that we might have across the landscape, achieving this over space and time. And so Will mentioned, you know, I work with TNC with some restoration work, but ironically, the genesis of a lot of this work began via TNC collaboration when I was working with Paul at UMass in 2004 through 2007, when we first started thinking a little bit about you know, there was a lot of emphasis going into, you know, restoration of early successional habitat, but we felt there was also a need possibly to translate that into late successional conditions. And so really this has been a TNC collaboration for a long time. And so again, appreciate Paboda and others allowing us to be here to talk about this. So let me get going here. So I think, you know, old growth and old forests and many other terms that I'll talk about throughout the presentation really have become kind of the emphasis point for both national policies, local discussions about whether we should manage forests or not. And so right now there's a lot of interest in old forests and old growth forests, but historically really a lot of why we were managing and thinking about trying to restore these forests is that whether we're sitting in Pennsylvania or Vermont or Massachusetts or West Virginia, when we look at the contemporary landscape and think about that in the context of what historically used to predominate, it was clear that old growth was quite rare relative to how abundant it used to be. And so from just a perspective of trying to restore a condition that many felt was the predominant condition over large areas, we often were saying, you know, there's a need to restore this and bring this back as part of that larger landscape complexity. But the last 5 years or so have seen old growth, as I mentioned, really become an area of emphasis, and of course, an area of some political disagreement too about how we should be thinking about forests. And there's different reasons for that. And one, you know, I think really good reason is that we recognize how important these forests are as part of the package of supporting native biodiversity in an area. Likewise, you know, old forests, you know, with the accumulation of big trees, accumulation of dead wood, thick litter layer, often tend to have the highest amount of carbon storage in an area. And then at the same time, that diversity of conditions we find in old forests, you know, mixture of age classes, you know, differences in spatial complexity across a given stand, have a lot of consistency with how we also think about factors that might lend themselves for adaptive capacity in the context of climate change. And so, you know, old growth has always been important, but we're now seeing more alignment between some contemporary objectives and those conditions that we find in old growth forest systems. And so what we're going to get into is, you know, how do we actually increase the representation of those conditions across the landscape? And importantly, as part of that larger balance that you all have been talking about as part of these dynamic forest restoration blocks. So before we do that, it's just worth reminding not this group, but others, as we think about old forest, that we shouldn't just emphasize that forest condition. And importantly, the first thing we should emphasize is forest writ large, whether you are on the southern end of the Alps or the northern end of the Alps. We are seeing, over the last 2 decades, a reversing of what was a very, inspiring trend of forest cover recovering across the region. We're now seeing forest loss for the first time in over a century in parts of our region. And so the first thing I think we want to make sure we're emphasizing before we kind of get into like how we manage the land is that we want to make sure we're not losing forests, and particularly not fragmenting large blocks of interior forest. At the same token, and again, I'm preaching to the choir, there are many species that certainly might use old forests for parts of their life stage, but there are others that really need complex young forest conditions across the landscape to support them. And so really supporting that diversity of values, again, why we're so inspired with the way you're all approaching thinking about forest management across different landscape scales. And I think the final piece is that from a political standpoint, we often see old forests used as a reason to argue that we shouldn't be cutting in an area, often, either for ethical reasons or for a desire to restore, large carbon stocks to a given area. And what we've been really talking about a lot is that, if we were to cease cutting in an area, but still consume at the same rate that we do for wood products, it really perpetuates this dynamic that's been called the illusion of preservation, where we're locally protecting, but we're globally consuming. And really, we want to make sure that we're being equitable in how we're actually owning our consumerism as a society. And so this figure on the right, just some work we did for New England recently, that just shows as a region in terms of consumption versus removals, our region actually is a net exporter of its demand. And so really trying to think about, if we're going to be managing for old forests and thinking about how we go about doing that, we need to also right size, our consumption and how that kind of balances across other values. So to get into this, I've already been using some terms interchangeably throughout this, and so it's worth just cleaning up terminology. Again, I recognize most of you are experts in this, but just getting you on the same page with at least how Paul and I approach this. And that this workshop, we're talking about late successional forests, and really in many cases, we're talking about restoring aspects of what we consider conditions found in old growth ecosystems, so ecosystems that really have been developing primarily under natural dynamics for long periods of time. And so the term old growth is one that's been defined clearly for a long time, and it's a pretty stringent definition that most of us use, in that these are forests that have never been directly impacted by intensive human land uses. So agricultural clearing, clear cutting, repeated cutting for charcoaling, you name it. Really the conditions that have given birth to a lot of the forests we look at today. Importantly, we really are associating this with intensive human land uses. And the reason for that is there certainly were use of these lands and interaction with these lands long before intensive European uses. And so we're acknowledging that indigenous burning and indigenous gathering and use of these forests certainly was occurring, but those are much more consistent with the functioning of these ecosystems. And so we include those forests that may have only been impacted by historic indigenous practices, which are very rare, if not absent from our landscape, as ones that we would also consider reflective of old growth. Humans were on our landscape, long before European settlement, as we all appreciate. So what are we dealing with today? Lots of second growth forests. Again, forests that established following that intensive human land use, so that mass homogenization that has occurred over large scales throughout our region. Really, what we're dealing with now is kind of the outgrowth of that land use. And so what we're trying to do now is, can we actually restore some of those conditions that may have been found in old growth? And so what we're really trying to bring back are old forests. So forests that have an accumulation of those characteristics that we associate with old growth, because they have a history of being second growth, right? They've actually been impacted by intensive land use. They never can be like a true old growth ecosystem from a scientific standpoint, but we're trying to restore, a large quantity of those conditions that may have been associated with old forests. And these really are kind of what we're shooting for in our approaches to restoring these conditions on the landscape. So this map on the left and then the figure on the right that's derived from it are now 10 years old. So add 10 to 13 years to these estimates. And not that we need this map to talk about what we're dealing with in the region, but what we're looking at here, the color coding actually corresponds to, are the forests at, below, or above peak net ecosystem productivity? So are they at or below a peak sequestration rate? And so anything that's red is over 100 years old, and anything that's a different color than that is actually less than 100. And so all of us appreciate kind of the history of our region. I apologize to Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. They're not on this map, but the trend holds as you move further south. And if I were to take this map and then translate it into what it means in terms of the area of different age classes, again, adding 10 to 13 years to this, a lot of our forests really throughout that Appalachian region are anywhere from 65 to 95 years old, really very much so, reflecting that history of intensive land use at the turn of the last century. And so that age bin, those that have been following some of the discussion around old forests that have kind of made national policy veins, also have a new term that we're dealing with called mature forest, which is a tricky one because it's never really been defined ecologically. We know economic maturity, but ecological maturity, what does that really mean? But a lot of the definitions often include forests that are 85 to 100 years old. And really, I think what's important to remind everyone, again, this group is well advanced, it doesn't need to be reminding of this, that our forests are very ecologically young. You can call them mature if you want, but 85 to 110-year-old forests are very much ecologically young ecosystems. And so if we're dealing with these forests in this age class, are there ways for us to actually accelerate them towards a more ecologically mature condition? So what I'm going to do is get into talking about different ways to restore old growth forest conditions. Again, I recognize many of you do this in your own practice or have thought this through. So hopefully this is useful just to talk through just some of the ways we look at it through both the silvicultural lens, but also through the lens of kind of landscape scale conservation and planning. And I'm going to start kind of with kind of the dichotomy and pathways, how we can get there, either through a passive approach or an active approach, and then kind of drill into the specific old growth conditions we might be trying to restore and what are the actual benchmarks we might be striving for, and then how do we actually get there with forest management. So regardless of how you end up implementing treatments on the ground for restoring this condition, there are really two key principles to think through and try to embrace in your planning around creating and restoring and enhancing these old forest conditions out there in a landscape. And the first is manage for complexity. I know we use the word complexity a lot, but really what I'm talking about is at the stand scale, when you're doing silvicultural prescriptions, when you're doing management, that you're really trying to emulate that spatial and temporal complexity that we find in old growth forests, that is really the accumulation of centuries of small scale, mesoscale disturbances across space and time that really create a whole range in densities and levels of canopy cover and species composition in a stand. And so with your silviculture, really trying to embrace that and manage for that. And the second piece is a bit of a rewiring. Again, we're all enlightened and can think about leaving trees behind out in the forest, but in general, so much of how we're trained and how we think about managing forests is that we're focused on the removals. We're managing really for like the trees that we're ultimately going to take out of that stand and use. And that's certainly still a big piece of what we're talking about here. But if we really want to restore some of those conditions that are found in old growth forests, across all community types, a component of that are large, old, decadent trees that really require time and us being willing to say that we're just going to leave them there to die in the woods. And so really focusing in on that legacy component, that's such a big part of how we actually get to some of these goals, especially when we're starting with forests that are 85 to 110 years old. So one way to go about doing this is to not do anything other than ensure that that forest stays forest and that no one does any management in that forest into the future. And so one of the pathways we talk about, and all of you are certainly familiar with, and certainly include as part of landscape scale planning, is that we have areas where we are establishing as reserves or wildlands or places we call natural areas, where basically the idea is that we will allow natural processes to be the predominant influence on this ecosystem over time. And so this is often one strategy discussed in the context of old forest. If we want forests to get old, why don't we just let them develop on their own through this pathway? What's critical, and again, all of us appreciate this, I know we're all kind of an action-oriented group, but if you want to see results in 10 years, this is obviously a pathway that's not necessarily going to generate that. This diagram on the bottom right is for our region, but again, many of your forests kind of span a similar condition, and that if we're starting out here today and think about how long it takes to accumulate, let's say, large trees to the level that would actually be considered approximating the benchmark conditions we see in old forests, it's another 100 years before we really start seeing that goal achieved. And so if you're comfortable with that, and really kind of feel like there's not a need to kind of advance more quickly along this pathway, it's certainly a key piece. But what's critical is that your intent for these areas is communicated. If there is a wind throw or spongy moth outbreak or beech leaf disease or hemlock woolly adelgid or any other disturbance working through these areas, killing lots of trees, a key decision from a management standpoint is that you do not intervene. Basically, you're allowing that to be part of kind of that structural development over time. And so it's I think, a key consideration in this pathway. The other piece is that as we see discussions, and I mentioned that, I don't want to get into the social and political dynamics of old forest, but there's certainly a lot of discussion that why don't we just leave everything alone and then it will become old forest. And as all of you appreciate, there are many stands that, as much as I would like to say, if we left them alone, would become wonderfully complex ecosystems without our intervention. There are many stands that definitely are not on that trajectory, whether it's because they have a proliferation of invasive plants, they're starting from kind of a novel place, like an old civilian conservation corps plantation, or they're already seeing the impacts of beech leaf disease or beech bark disease or other dynamics that really are preventing them from growing large trees in both the near term and the long term. And so if you're doing passive strategies as part of your approach, really being genuine in how you actually site those. So putting those in places where there actually is the potential for that forest to develop on this complex structure. Recognizing the future is uncertain, there's a lot of changes that could happen in that place, but at least today, picking stands that actually could over time develop into those conditions passively, I think is a real key piece for this. But as I confessed, I'm a more action-oriented person as are others. And part of that mindset is that we don't have much of this forest condition on the landscape. And so if we really do care about breeding biodiversity and cultural and other values by restoring that, the quickest way we can get there is actually through management pathways. And so that's really what I'm going to spend the remainder of my portion of the talk talking about. And in particular, all of us recognize, and the reason why we're having this conversation is that there are some tools in our toolbox that really can help us accelerate, some of those conditions that would take much longer to be achieved via passive approach. At the same time, one of the reasons why I tend to like the active approach is that it's much more adaptive. You're really out there thinking about long-term dynamics and how it interacts with your management. And so you can kind of balance things in terms of regeneration environments that a species might need. And so instead of allowing kind of natural gaps to be the only formation of canopy openings in that ecosystem, you can think through, if I really want a significant oak component in this forest over time, how do I balance the regeneration needs of that species with some of the structural goals that we have for old forest systems? And so this active approach, I think, provides more opportunity to really integrate some of these objectives and thinking around what our goals are for these sites over time. So what I'm going to go through are just some basic strategies for restoration, kind of beginning just with a general principle of how we should be looking at stands and landscapes prior to doing this, and then getting into some of the structural conditions we find in compositional conditions we find in old forests, and both what we know in terms of like the benchmarks that we see for existing old growth stands, and then how do we actually get there with active management. But the first step in any of this is why work against what might already be there. And what I mean by that is, we all, experience this, walking through the woods. Occasionally you'll come across an area that either has, just a small patch of large trees, or an area that recently had a windstorm, or places that might have some populations of plants that are dispersal limited, that really are already kind of showing some conditions that we would want to see over a larger scale in that ecosystem over time. And so really trying to make sure that your activities in that stand, or again, if you have these like at a stand scale, are being protected as you start getting into active management mode. And so really identifying those places within a stand and protecting them from the impact of equipment or other aspects of the management regime you're going to do. And so establishing kind of small patch reserves, groups of legacy trees around those features, half acre to an acre in size, just to kind of work with that on the site as part of kind of achieving your long-term goals. It's also bringing in already some spatial heterogeneity into that stand, because you now have one area that is going to be developing very differently than other areas that you're going to be managing. To that spatial heterogeneity piece, a large aspect, whether we're talking about, fire-dependent woodlands or mesic northern hardwood forests, when we look at, natural systems or systems even that have been influenced by a long-term history of human, disturbance like indigenous burning, when we look at the structure of those forests, there's spatial variability is really the norm. And what I mean by that, again, is that some areas have dense clumps of trees, other areas have scattered trees, other areas have kind of recovering canopy gaps. And so most of our forests today are pretty homogeneous in their spatial structure. And so the first step often when we're trying to restore actively these old growth conditions is that how do I implement regeneration harvests that are going to start kind of restoring that spatial complexity and conditions. And so using those regeneration methods that really combine both individual and group removals of trees. So things like, hybrid single tree group selection approaches, irregular shelter woods, variable density thinnings, all of these really are meant to both work with existing heterogeneity, but also impose heterogeneity into that ecosystem over space and time to really kind of restore some of that complexity. And so in the forest that we work in, kind of in our region, often we're talking about trying to emulate a range of canopy gaps at a high frequency, like a 10th acre to a half acre, as well as also thinking about integrating those mesoscale events that are so important, like downbursts and even tornado events that might have kind of areas that are less impacted than other spots. And so kind of those larger areas that can be open with heavy retention. So looking at that through the lens of aerial photos and LiDAR, on the left is just an example of an area where they're using kind of a hybrid single tree group selection approach. So you can see kind of the regeneration openings in blue, the more yellow areas are where they're actually reducing the density to 70 to 80 square feet to try to accelerate large tree growth. And then the red patches are areas where they're not doing any cutting, so kind of protecting unique ecological features. And so once this harvest was implemented, you've kind of created this spatial heterogeneity that really was not present in that stand on the day before. And so really trying to generate that complexity, not overnight, but over the course of a harvest to generate that at the stand scale. Similarly, on the right, we're just looking at kind of a mesoscale event being emulated. So here, this is a northern hardwood system. So they're retaining 40 to 60 square feet of basal area in these 1 to 3 acre openings across this 50 acre unit. But again, that retention can be lower depending on your regeneration goals. But the idea being that you're really seeing that patchiness being implemented that would be analogous to what might happen in a downburst disturbance in that landscape. Moving into your landscapes, this is actually an aerial on the left of kind of impact of a mesoscale downburst in Tennessee that Justin Hart created. And so this is a natural disturbance event, but you can see that heterogeneity and impact. Again, all of us appreciate this, that there's small gaps, there's medium-sized gap, there's one large gap. And so really creating that type of condition with our regeneration harvest is beginning that process of restoring that spatial complexity that we really associate with old growth forests over larger areas. And on the right is actually some work from North Carolina in some mesophytic hardwoods where they're doing kind of that initial entry in an irregular shelterwood approach where they're kind of creating that range of gap sizes that they will ultimately be expanding across that site, the picture below showing that. So spatial heterogeneity is the most important kind of backbone of thinking about old forests. But of course, when people talk about, late successional forests, old growth forests, we often are talking about big and old trees. And so I can't help on the old part. There's not an old aging serum we can inject into the trees, but we certainly can think a little bit about, the big part. And so what I'm showing here, I'm going to show this for several slides in red. These are examples of the range of densities of trees greater than 20 inches in diameter that we see across the literature and really across our region, so the whole Appalachian region, for 3 broad forest types. I recognize only a few of you are working in spruce fir as well, but if we focus in on the central hardwood region, the density that we find in old growth forests ranges anywhere from 4 trees that are 20 inches in diameter per acre up to 18 trees. And if you look at the forest types, this is really kind of the broadest range we see. And that really reflects, and again, you all appreciate this way better than I do, just that range of site types that support oak systems. And so these can be xeric, kind of more open woodlands to more kind of mesic oak systems that have higher densities of trees. And so that range of densities really speaks to kind of catering your targets to the site type you're working with, as well as the prevailing disturbance regime. Are we talking about restoring an old woodland, or are we talking about restoring kind of an old closed canopy stand? So thankfully, we know how to grow big trees. And again, kind of the mindset piece, we often are then growing those big trees to remove them. But in the context of restoring old forest conditions, Now we are growing trees quickly with the intent that some are going to be left to die, which again is tough. But if the goal really is to restore these old forest characteristics, we need to be leaving some of our what we consider our crop trees as future legacy trees. And so, working within both northern hardwoods, oak systems, crop tree release, really kind of depending on the developmental stage of the stand, really is a great way to do this. Many of you are already well versed and familiar with this, but choosing 40 to 60 dominant and co-dominant trees, doing minimum of 3-sided release. And so that 40 to 60 trees, doesn't translate directly into 4 to 18, like 20-inch trees. And the reason for that is that we're really carrying this 40 to 60 trees as our initial population of crop trees that are going to be either left to die, possibly removed in future regeneration harvests, or actually used as future sources of dead wood. And so we're trying to kind of build at the beginning a large population of big trees to work with that then we're kind of either removing for commercial harvest in the future or actually including as future treatment options. So why do we like thinking about active management? Well, in the context of growing big trees, again, the reason we thin forests in general is that we can accelerate on the average tree size across the stand. And so I'm taking that same diagram, again, I'm thinking about all of our forests being in this range here. And based on the work that many have done, both in northern hardwoods as well as working in oak systems, we have a good sense for just based on average diameter growth and development, like how long does it take for trees to get into these size classes. And so these numbers in the bottom just show this is the range in a northern hardwood forest of large trees and old stands. So it's like 12 to 20 trees per acre. And so if I start with a current northern hardwood stand, 85 to 100-year-old northern hardwood stand, they're really at a very, very small percentage of this range. But if I use crown thinning in those stands over time, by age 40, I'm already starting to get a density of trees that approximates the lower bound of what we'd see in an old forest. And so really kind of truncating and accelerating that condition over time. If we want trees to get old and large and die, then we need to be good about informing others that that is our intent and we're leaving legacy trees. And so a key piece of this is not just growing trees to large sizes, but consciously deciding on trees that are going to spend the rest of their lives and out in the forest. And so legacy trees, so all of us are familiar with this, but these are trees that are being designated as permanent reserves out in that ecosystem. And so what we select for those trees might be very different than what we select for, sawlog and veneer quality trees. And in particular, one big ruffled tree, really is tremendous ecologically, possibly horrendous economically. And so really, if you can, from like a trade-off perspective, prioritizing those trees that might not be as much as a challenge economically to justify leaving out there. Big cull are fantastic. Likewise, I'll talk about this a bit more, but trees that already have existing cavities, which historically were like the priority for removal in kind of our traditional tree quality guidelines, you can't just create a cavity tree. And so really trying to protect those and emphasize those, as well as those that might have complex structures, whether it's the bark structure or the crown form, as well as, when we're getting into areas where we might have, a small amount of red spruce in a mixed wood stand, like protecting that unique seed source, and certainly choosing trees that are built to last. And so this picture right here, the breeze of me just walking by those trees, I think knocked them over. Those are not trees that architecturally are going to last, much longer than a few months. And so really choosing trees that can last. One challenge is documenting this. So, certainly in the field, this paint that says leave, you don't need to go to an extreme like that. That's going to last, maybe a decade. So that's not necessarily the best permanent way to communicate the intent, but using obviously a geospatial as well as even monumenting those trees physically in the woods, whether it's burying a 10-penny nail or something next to them to try to make sure that people know which trees out there are meant to stay over time and well into the future is important. What's I think also challenging is that when we're talking about leaving things behind, so much of how we approach management and a lot of our guidelines are meant to optimize tree and stand level growth. And so we're often trying to stay away from some basal area levels and retention levels that might either interfere with regeneration goals or interfere with kind of optimizing the use of that site for production of growth. And so we need to at least accept that if we're used to using certain basal area benchmarks or other guides, that we have to start building in that there's going to be some basal area, some stocking out there that's just going to be left. And so, as we're marking, as we're thinking through how we implement these things, we're making sure that we're factoring that in. one key thing is that, those of us that work in, on even age management, we often have a max diameter above which everything's cut. Well, we need to get rid of that idea if we're going to actually leave things to die. So we're going to leave those legacy trees and allow them to be part of that stocking into the future. Likewise, this is a oak stocking guide that's been modified by Miranda Curzon and John Cabrick just to show different oak forest conditions depending on what you're managing for. And so our beeline stocking we're all comfortable with as being often that lower bound of optimal stocking that we're managing for. But if we're actually leaving legacies behind and trying to carry those forward in those thinnings and other treatments, we need to kind of factor that in. And so maybe we have for lack of a better term, an L line. We're actually carrying a little bit higher basal area in places to account for those legacies that we want to have out in the site. Besides living trees of large sizes, we also are thinking about dead trees. And there's a lot of variation in this. And in our oak central hardwoods, certainly a lower level than we see in northern hardwoods and spruce fir, just by nature of both the productivity of those sites as well as the dynamics of those ecosystems. But nevertheless, if we look at, levels of deadwood in old forest conditions, we generally see on average 3 to 8 cords per acre on the ground, which is not a trivial amount of dead wood out there in a forest. So this isn't meant to be interpreted as, well, tomorrow I need to create that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I also think it's worth pointing out that this is often a challenging goal depending on what your other objectives are for the site. And so if your goal isn't to fully meet this benchmark, oftentimes we talk about maybe dividing these number in two and still trying to have at least maybe 2 to 7 trees per acre, that kind of are falling in this deadwood range. So how do we get deadwood? A little different than live trees. With silviculture for deadwood, we use morticulture. So being thoughtful and thinking about, deliberately managing for deadwood. Often kind of initial entries when we're trying to really get that deadwood level back up, we're talking about 8 to 10 large diameter trees per acre. And so these could be some of those trees that you're either viewing as like your ecological crop trees, or that you're using to release those crop trees in the future. And then relying on both natural dynamics as well as going out there in the future to create future deadwood legacies out there on the site. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Obviously, it's easiest to cut and leave things, but there are places and individuals that certainly, if you want to emulate a tip-up mound, using that the feather buncher to kind of push things over is one option. But obviously, if you're trying to do this economically and operationally and efficiently, then that can often be a challenge. And so again, a lot of the work we do, many of the managers are just cutting and leaving things, but we do have some situations where they are kind of pushing over trees to create tip-up mounds as at least part of this dynamic, which is clearly a better natural analog, but not easier said than done. So one thing I think it's important about this is often people view this, well, I've created my deadwood, now I can pass go and I don't need to worry about it again. But when we're really looking at old forests and the conditions that we find in them, really there's this condition we call that deadwood continuum, where we have everything from freshly fallen trees to really well-decayed wood across that stand. And this picture on the right kind of gives you a good sense for that. We have these more fresh kind of decay class 1 logs that are fallen on top of decay class 4 logs. And so really this is the result of a long-term history of deadwood being created in that stand over time. And so when we're doing this, and if we're actually going to be entering these forests repeatedly, we want to make sure that every entry we're actually factoring in creating new deadwood pulses, because we want to be emulating and creating that range of deadwood across the site. If all we're creating is kind of one pulse of deadwood, we're going to have really one flavor of that decay class over time. That's really not going to support all the species that need a diversity of deadwood. The other piece of the deadwood pool that again is even more challenging to create than down logs are snags and cavity trees. And so these benchmarks, again, these don't just include dead trees, they include trees that show cavities and decline. So these include living trees. And so for oak central hardwoods, again, 8 to 15 square feet per acre in large snags is often what historically has been observed. And again, some of those being trees that are still hanging on and declining. So how do we create these? This is a little bit, tricky in that often people will say, and certainly one strategy to go about doing that is to girdle a tree like here. This is an example in Wisconsin where they're girdling this tree. Obviously made it clear with the S that that's a tree to create a snag from. But there are two issues with that. One, obviously, is the safety consideration. If you're going to be girdling trees, thinking about kind of future operations on that site and where you're going to have a snag, and kind of how you might operate around that. But the bigger consideration is biological, and in general, all of you appreciate it more than me because you actually know a lot more about the organisms that use these trees than I do. But what makes a great cavity tree is often, it has natural heart rot occurring within it, and so those cavity nesting, the cavity excavators are kind of sensing that out and picking those trees as kind of the trees that they're going to be using and creating in the cavity trees. And so when we look at actually the function of girdled trees as cavity trees, they tend to be far less valuable, and they certainly ultimately get some colonization by cavity nesters, but it's far less functional than a tree that actually naturally develops cavities in it. And so my attitude is that if you want to create snags, one of the better approaches is just to let trees die out in the forest, and in particular to protect trees like this sugar maple. This is on the Green Mountain National Forest, where they've left this as a legacy tree. It's already got a cavity in it, and the function of that tree over time is going to be far greater than this tree that they're creating a snag in. Just a very different dynamic there. Last feature I'll talk about before kind of talking a little bit about the stand prescriptions and then getting into Paul's portion is that, besides the tree component, when we look at other aspects of old forest, that there are also, depending on the community, certain plant species that are very dispersal limited that tend to have higher abundance in old forest, largely because, when we cleared other areas, they were eliminated, and it's taking a long time for those plants to recolonize those spots. And so that's a desired feature. We can't, go out there and sow these species across the landscape. Although I know you're an industrious group, I maybe wouldn't recommend that as a strategy. But instead, just trying to protect those when you have them within a stand. And so again, that idea of having these reserve patches, if you have either pockets of trees that are showing well advanced bryophyte and lichen communities, or even pockets of advanced regeneration that know takes a while to build up in a given community, protecting those and retaining features around them to sustain that into the future stand really is a key step. And so just making sure that you're not further exacerbating both the time it takes for those populations to build up, as well as just the limitations some of those species have to disperse across the landscape. So in terms of doing this with active management, there are two types of approaches we think about. And one is, it took a while to figure out where it got in my brain, but I guess there was like a infomercial about some rotisserie oven. They said, set it and forget it. You put your chicken in, and I guess it's cooked and done in 10 minutes. So the same idea, set it and forget it. How do we restore old growth? So one option is that, we are largely going to take a long-term passive approach, but the idea is that, trying to get a jump start and really push that forest a bit further down the trajectory, in the near term, just knowing that it's going to take a while for some of these features to develop. And so this diagram on the bottom is just kind of illustrating an example where, doing a combination of, designating legacy trees, felling some dead wood, creating some gap openings to create new cohorts in that stand, and then walking away from that stand and allowing it to kind of naturally develop over time to accumulate some of those old growth features. And so that's certainly one way to go about doing that. And oftentimes when they're designating kind of reserve areas, some of our state folks in Vermont have talked about that, this is going to be designated as old forest. Before we exclude management, we're going to allow kind of this one kind of entry that will kind of push it a little bit further down that trajectory. One drawback to this is obviously you don't have that adaptive piece where you can go back out there, in 20 years, maybe adjust your management. Certainly this is going to favor, unless you're really deliberate with it, in that initial entry, more tolerant species. And then again, that deadwood continuum, you're really not factoring in being able to actually create more deadwood over time on that site. So the way that I tend to think about it, again, if you have the option to do multiple entries and long-term planning, is that you do not need to restore all these conditions in one entry. And to be honest, it's a lot to take on, right? You're trying to restore a condition that takes centuries to develop. It's hard to do that in a single stand entry. And so I often think about it more in terms of, do we have a long-term ecological silvicultural system that allows us to actually go out there and think about over time, how am I going to adapt to how this forest is responding to my treatments, and do it in ways that really support the ecological values and functions that we might see in an old growth system. So again, working with northern hardwood systems, we might be thinking about an initial entry that's really trying to establish a new cohort and trying to accelerate some of those structural components that really will be a key part of my future legacy trees and retention into the future. And then in subsequent entries, really kind of respond to how the regeneration is developing either shifting more into an irregular shelterwood mode where I'm expanding gaps, but trying to actually balance that need to both retain and recruit legacy trees while also trying to regenerate species that are important for long-term dynamics in that site. And so obviously the advantage of this is we can create that mosaic of conditions more quickly. We can be more adaptive, but we also need to make sure that we're factoring in the reality of the economics of multiple entries into an area where we're often telling the logger to leave a lot behind and even like do things like fell trees and leave them. So there's certainly some issues there. So just to point this out in context of central hardwoods, this is some work again by Miranda Curzon and John Cabrick, and just showing, depending on the oak site you're on, whether you're dealing with an area where it's more of a woodland or savanna type ecosystem or a forest ecosystem, really thinking over time, how is that forest developing, and are there ways for me to actually kind of work with those conditions to try to accelerate some of that complexity using different regeneration methods is key. So the last comment I'll make before I put it over to Paul is that we can't do this everywhere, but when we think about even early successional targets, and certainly some of the work that's come out of monitoring harvest throughout Central Appalachian region, that even some of our shrubland birds, 5%, 10% retention can still be using that habitat. And so thinking through, how do we just factor in leaving trees behind across all places? Again, not at high densities if our goal is to try to regenerate certain species and support shrubland birds. But that large tree component really is absent from much of our landscape. And so integrating retention of legacy trees, I think, is just a key part of how we should be thinking about management across the board. So it's not just late successional management, but also integrating some of those elements into what we do in the landscape. And Paul will talk about that a bit more with his part. So Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Tony. As Will mentioned in his opening comments, the goal of today isn't to provide specific prescriptions today, right? The idea, I think it's more valuable to think about this on a gradient. And Tony put up a citation. I don't know if you noticed it, the Bohus citation, and they've got a term in there that I love. It's old growthness. So to me, the idea of the strategies is to mix and match, is to match them to the site, to the landscape, to the landowner goals, and choose sort of where on the gradient, how much old growthness that you're looking to develop. And so we put this diagram into our publication to help communicate that it's not meant to be a cookbook. Like, here's your prescription in all forest types and all sites and all landscapes. Instead, this is one of the wonderful, huge benefits of our profession, that we tailor it to not only the stand level, but the landscape level. So depending on what you're interested in or the landowner's goals, there are a variety of intensities in which you can apply these strategies. If you are interested in lots of old growthness within your forest, then you'd be further to the left. It might be a passive approach. It might be designating a quarter, even up to half of the trees as legacy trees that will remain on that stand. However, on the far right side of the gradient, you might be interested in less old growthness in those forests. And so that might mean just even identifying a legacy tree, a couple legacy trees per acre, keeping your eye on the coarse weedy debris, but largely implementing, more standard silvicultural systems. And of course, there aren't 4 or 5 gradients in here. It's almost an infinite amount of gradients, depending on all those factors that you're considering. Tony, would you advance that? So it's important, like all things in life, right? There are trade-offs here. And so one thing that Tony and I really focused on between the first and this most recent publication is emphasizing the fact that we're not only trying to reach our structural goals of restoring old growth characteristics, but as Tony's mentioned a number of times in his talk, also hitting those species composition goals. And so obviously, if you're interested in regenerating more on the shade intolerant side, you're going to be further to the right of the gradient, and vice versa if you're more interested in those shade tolerant. So mixing and matching, how much old growthness structure are you interested in recruiting and sustaining, and intersecting that with your species composition goals. We also need to recognize that the further left you are, there are trade-offs to both of these. So the further left you are, you're going to have more on-site carbon storage, greater amounts of late successional habitat, of course. And if you're on the right-hand side of the gradient, there are more opportunities for producing wood products, early successional habitat, and so forth. So it really is a gradient here, but there are opportunities to find yourself and implement some of these strategies, no matter what this combination of goals are. Next slide, please. So we can think of this at both the stand and landscape levels. So as Tony mentioned, at the stand level, identifying where we are, and what existing structures and features there are. And our stands are getting to that age. A lot of them are approaching 100 years old. We're getting those diameters. We're getting, some of that dead wood and some of that complexity starting. Identify those. Don't just designate those areas that are inoperable, wetlands, steep slopes. We want to recognize that the development of these structures are going to happen on better quality sites, right? We know there's going to be more biomass growing out there. The growth is going to be accelerated on these sites. And we want at the landscape level to make sure that we're representing natural communities across the spectrum. So we want dry sites, we want mesic sites, we want sites in between, high elevation, low elevation. We want these kinds of structural attributes and forest developing across that spectrum. Next slide. So let's talk about that landscape. If you can advance that, Tony. So for many of us along, and one more, Tony, for many of us along the Appalachians, this is what our landscapes look like. We've got these public lands, or we have some NGO lands or municipal lands. And then of course, we've got this matrix of family forest owner land ownership within the landscape. Next slide. So if you were to think about each one of these columns, each one of these rectangles as its own parcel, begin hopefully envisioning where, the landowner can be on that gradient to meet their goals, but still recruit, still create, still facilitate the creation of more of that old growthness. So some landowners might be interested in that active approach and focusing more on the tolerant, mid-tolerant. Others might be very interested in an active approach, but early successional habitat, or recruiting some of those intolerant species into their species composition mix. And so it's going to look different, but we're going to have elements of that old growthness throughout. Next slide. So across the landscape, essentially what we'll have is some of these biological legacies that are consistent with what we see in natural disturbance in our forests, but also these ecological stepping stones across the landscape, even though there's a diversity of strategies applied. Next slide. So ultimately, it's not, this argument between is it passive or active. That's a decision that should be made at the property level, at the landscape level, and the reality is we need both across the landscape. Next slide. So it shouldn't be, or we shouldn't think about this as black and white, that I'm either a person that does all passive or I'm a person that does all active. Advance, please. As opposed to thinking about this in shades of green, like where am I on this gradient? All of this is recruiting some old growthness. How do I combine it with my other goals? Next slide. And how do I start thinking about this at a landscape scale? Advance, please. And one more. So that there are a variety of shades of green, right? There are people everybody has different kinds of goals. There'll be a different gradient, parts of that gradient, but the reality is they're all hopefully, or you are all, or we're all recruiting more of that old growth. Next slide. And so despite the parcelization, the fragmentation we've got in our landscape, being on that gradient at some point helps restore that heterogeneity across the landscape. And then we're sort of weaving it back together with those structural elements across those parcel lines. Next slide. Next, advance, please. So I know a lot of you are working on maybe a focused property, but as I said, you're also within this matrix of private landowners. Next, advance. So how do you reach out to these landowners? Advance. So as a forester, you can be a convener. You can be the people that reach out to people, family forest owners within your landscape, let them know, communicate what you're up to, what you're doing, and what their opportunities are, what strategies they can employ. Advance. There are huge opportunities for peer-to-peer, landowners talking to one another about why they're doing this, why restoring old growth is important, how they did it, what their experience was. Next slide, or next, yeah. And don't, I'm a huge pie and coffee guy. I'm a huge potluck guy, you know, like getting people together in your landscape. These public lands, if you're a public land manager, or if you're working for TNC, you've got some fee-owned lands. These are anchor points within our landscape around which you can sort of use to anchor not only ecological kinds of activities, but also social activities. How do you pull people together, peer-to-peer, potlucks, convening as a forester and providing technical assistance? Next slide. Next. So importantly, and Tony touched on this, the long-term planning is huge. Whether you're marking the trees, advance please, creating the stand maps, using GIS to track this next, or actually incorporating with your management plans, it's huge. You know, this takes decades or even centuries to develop. So long-term planning and being able to communicate this to the next managers is important. Next slide. Or yep. And if you're working with private landowners, the importance of conservation-based estate planning and land protection can't be overemphasized. Without that time frame, without those decades and centuries, this structure is simply not going to have the opportunity to be created. Next slide. So next point, please. So recognize that what we need is a combination of passive and active strategies across the landscape. Next point is, there's a tension here, right? There's sort of this emotional, passionate conversation. Some people that want to, have this passive approach, others that are interested on more of the active management side, and we need to balance that tension. We need to shift the conversation from either or to it's both, and they leverage each other and they complement each other, and different sites, different landscapes, different ownerships and goals will lend themselves to these approaches. If you're interested in passive approach, great, we need you. And if you're interested in active, great, we need you too. Next. Recognize the importance of the gradient. This isn't meant to be a cookbook, all right? This is meant to actually play to the strengths of foresters, which is understanding the site, understanding the context, and being creative in the application of these strategies. Next. Please look at that landscape context. Hugely important, not only in the opportunities to connect areas of older forests, but also recognizing the challenges that might be in the landscape that might prohibit the development of these characteristics that we're talking about. Next. And of course, that long-term planning piece can't be overemphasized in terms of communicating both the management, the stewardship, but also ensuring that we've got continuous forest cover on private land for decades and centuries to come. Next slide. So I'd like to thank our partners who've been hugely helpful, both in terms of funding, but expertise and insight in this, that have really re-energized Tony and I and getting this work back up and going and into the right hands like yours and all the great work you're doing. And last slide, Tony. And of course, when we were writing this 20 years ago, this quote really just stood out to us, the importance of, we have ecologically young forests. We're missing some of our cogs and wheels. This work can help restore that, knit the landscape together, and we feel as though it's a really important approach to facing, the challenges our forests are trying to move through. So thank you very much for your time. And I don't know if there is time for questions, but be happy to take a couple.
Yeah, thank you both, Paul and Tony. I think I had seen a scaled down version of this presentation on YouTube for the Vermont Land Trust, and this one really dug deeper and was fulfilling in that way. I think we're gonna go ahead and take our break. We'll break until 10:10. But if Paul and Tony, if you all are okay to stick around during the break and stay online to answer any questions that may remain, we can take that approach. And then at 10:10, we'll reconvene with a presentation from Dan Heggenstaller and Sarah Wurzbacher from the Pennsylvania Game Commission.
Thanks, Will. You're going to hear a lot of similarities between the talk that we just heard and some of the concepts that we're approaching within the Game Commission. Thanks for the intro. We'll just roll right in. So our mission is a state agency with a large land base of about 1.5 million acres of state game lands in Pennsylvania. is really focused on wildlife outcomes, managing and protecting wildlife and their habitats while promoting hunting and trapping for current and future generations. This is really a primary objective that defines all of the forestry work that we do. Everything is habitat centric. And in alignment with those goals, each game lands is individually managed according to a comprehensive management plan built by regional staff that serve those game lands for desired future habitat conditions based on priority wildlife species and the opportunities in those landscapes. So this kind of approach, having really a sole focus on habitat, gives our foresters a lot of flexibility in their approaches to silviculture that lets us try some interesting stuff. So we've been experimental in our approaches to late succession. So why do we care so much about late successional management in particular? We are going to probably muddy up some terms a little bit. When we talk about late succession, we're really talking about a system rather than a specific structural condition. And we'll get a little bit more into that later. But
Sarah, I just wanted to interrupt you real quick. Are you sharing slides? Because we're not seeing them.
Shoot, sorry. Huh. Rookie mistake. Did not start the screen share. One moment. Thanks for that. I'll go back so you can see this beautiful picture of our colleague Aaron Tyson, underlining that some of those metrics I just talked about, our 1.5 million acre system, and that focus on comprehensive management planning, as well as the mission there, which you can read faster than I can talk. So why we care? We want to do a little bit of everything, everywhere, all the time.
So, as Sarah mentioned, each game lands has a comprehensive plan, and this is like a very common excerpt from one of our game lands plans. I'd say particularly from the larger forested game lands, you know, multi-thousand acre parcels. And I'll read it because it's pretty important for the rest of the talk. Forest management goal for such and such game lands is to develop and maintain highly interspersed forest age classes at the landscape level while ensuring desirable species composition and structural diversity at the stand level. So that includes attention to both young and old forests, because to have interspersed age classes, you need, a bunch of different age classes, including old ones. And it's also important because it calls out both our interest in species composition and also structural complexity at the stand level. So on a lot of our big game lands, this is kind of the landscape that we want to create, a really wide range of habitat conditions. We achieve a lot of that through commercial timber sales, even age management, fire, and just creating that really diverse landscape of a lot of different habitat types.
To Paul's earlier point, where on a large landscape, different landowners have different opportunities to sort of emphasize or specialize in certain types of management. We recognize that happens in the wider landscape, but even within our own footprint of land, that's really what we're after. We want to do a little bit of everything. So
this is sort of just kind of summing up some of our thoughts as we kind of prepared for this. At the landscape level, our approach to late succession is that it's the strategic designation and arrangement of permanent mature forest patches that kind of form the background of our diversified landscape. So we're going to do a lot of things on the landscape, but it's always important to have these structurally complex mature forests. And so they, of course, benefit wildlife species that like late successional structure, but they also, super important, they benefit a ton of generalist species and young forest dependent species when they're interspersed in that landscape of a lot of different age classes. And I think that's a really key thing to understand about how we approach late successional management. So this is just a map of one of our bigger game lands. It's over 20,000 acres. And our approach to kind of planning, and I noticed that in the intro to this webinar, there was a real similar management typing approach called out on a map. So that's pretty cool. So I'll just explain these real briefly because they're important to understand our approach here. So on this particular game lands, 42% of it is in what we call mixed succession management. And so I think the easiest way to quickly describe that as even age management. So that's where we're managing for a kind of maximum age class diversity, largely through commercial timber sales. So pretty significant part of the landscape. 16% of this game lands is in fire management. So the way to think about that is essentially those are places managed as open oak woodlands where we've generally reduced the basal area and we're using fire as a primary management tool to kind of maintain that open habitat. So there's aspects of that have some late successional elements because a lot of those trees are going to stay there forever or until they die on their own. But it does have that repeated understory disturbance. And I'll skip late and go to reserve. So 24% of this game lands is in reserve, which is essentially passive late successional management. We're not doing anything in there. We're going to probably spray it for spongy moth, but that's about it. We're not doing anything in there. Those are drainages. Those are tough places to access, sensitive sites. So it's a significant area of the game lands. And then lastly on this one, almost 20%, 18% is actively managed for late successional conditions. That's the dark green on this map here. And you can kind of see there are large areas that are in that category. There are small patches in that category, kind of scattered all over the game lands. And that's the management type that we're going to be talking about that today. And just, to kind of point out that this game lands isn't a real anomaly. It's in line with kind of the average of those designations across the north central region. So which areas do we designate for late successional management type? And I think it's important to note that those places aren't late successional now necessarily. They're places that we want to develop those conditions. It is not just the inoperable areas that like a lot of our reserve areas are those places, but the late successional areas are a mix of primarily operable areas, some areas that are tough to operate in, but they represent that full range of forest types on the landscape. And we're in particular focusing on important forest types for wildlife, like conifer dominated stands. On this game land, it's going to be white oak or healthy oak hickory stands. Corridors connecting old forests to each other, so connecting reserve areas to other reserve areas. And then smaller stands that are just critical for maintaining that habitat interspersion. So stands that are in a highly managed, even age dominated landscape. And we just recognize a healthy oak forest that we want to kind of maintain as a long-term mass producing stand in that landscape.
So that kind of helps us choose where we initiate these strategies, but then things get really granular down at the stand level where the individual taps and trajectories of the stand dynamics in those places are really played with. So stands that are designated for late successional management are most useful for wildlife when they are on a trajectory of desired species resilience and continued structural complexity. What that basically means is that we look at late succession as a system, not as an objective necessarily. So it's not like accomplishing a certain structural condition and saying, great, we did it. It's rather trying to manage this machine that will sort of continuously replace itself and offer something that is a persistent system on the landscape, not just a singular pulse of structure. We believe that active management is really essential to improving that trajectory for many stands, particularly when it comes to that species resiliency concept, which we'll speak a lot more about. So when we think about this, like we realize that it's not, I liked Paul's terms of old growthiness on a continuum, that there are these elements of structure that can be plussed up in certain areas, but really like we kind of reach for different opportunities in different spaces. Overall, when we think about our definitions, it's not so much restoration of old growth as multi-age forest systems for wildlife that can persist for that long time. So the way that we've kind of focused our objectives in these areas is that we're prioritizing the development of desirable species resiliency. If we have a forest type made up of vegetative species that are desirable, that are functional, that are functioning for wildlife, we want to maintain those species in those places. So this gets at those shade tolerance choices of the intensity of management, trying to match the appropriateness of the species there. Many passive approaches might actually result in species shifts away from less shade tolerant species. So we try to match to maintain desirable species over time. The mechanisms that we reach for those is through trying to establish multiple cohorts. So the opportunity for that stand to replace itself, resiliently spawn to unplanned disturbance, and the maintenance of continuous mature cover of big trees in the main canopy at all times. So second, to achieve structural goals over time as a byproduct of regeneration treatments. When we think about all of these desirable things that happen in older forests or late successional-ish forests, we think about these structural attributes and we really prioritize those, but we think about the hardest thing to do first, the regeneration events that result in these multiple cohorts. And these structural goals we look at as things that happen over time in this system, in that sort of pipeline of development of structural features. The variability that happens as a result of that sort of overtime building and the variability of the multiple cohort establishment happens over a long time scale. So additional unplanned disturbance that meets that stand will kind of additionally add further variability and help us kind of increase complexity overall. And finally, where some of those structural features are really important to us, we'll set specific targets and try to plus them up. Things like snags or den holes in certain areas through aggressive retention or other active management strategies. This is kind of I'm spending a lot of time on this slide, but this is really kind of the major set of principles that we're using to guide our choices about assigning silvicultural prescriptions in late successional areas.
So, a stand like this, it has a lot of things going for it from a potential future late successional stand. It's got a lot of mid-story complexity. There's quite a bit of variability in tree size. There's some woody debris. There's snags. But the trajectory of this stands like pretty poor, especially from a species resiliency standpoint. It's got nothing but hay-scented fern in the understory, striped maple in the mid-story. As this stand begins to get old and fall apart on its own, we're not gonna really achieve the kind of habitat objectives that we want in a stand like this. So, although some stands look pretty good now, their trajectory is pretty poor, and that one is kind of hard to improve without a lot of investment. So, on the other hand, this stand doesn't necessarily check all those boxes right now. It's kind of lacking that understory and mid-story structure, not a lot of dead wood, but it doesn't have tons of interference. It's got a really good carpet of established white oak regen. This one has a lot of opportunity for us to improve the trajectory and really do some good work in here. So I think that, to kind of sum up that approach, we're definitely being opportunistic. We're not only working in these stands, but we're going to focus our first effort on stands that kind of we can see some easy wins, like good regen or a place where you can expect to get some regen established, not a ton of invasives, stands that already have multiple cohorts. There's quite a lot of stands that have 2 ages already, and a big one for us is deer pressure. If low or moderate deer pressure is going to make things a lot easier, and of course stands that already have some of those old forest structural features, it's nice to start there.
So when we talk about those structural features, this is where we really enjoy having so many biologists on staff that help us see things through eyes of someone who knows how critters use it. So, many of those that Paul and Tony just walked through, big trees and small trees, a variety of things in different places along the landscape, the structural elements of conifer and thermal cover, the complexity horizontally and vertically, brushy areas with like high stem densities that are really low, no brush, downwood and snags and cavities for those those cover features. Those are the things that are really obvious to us, but they help us also see things like, well, when you have real big trees with crowns that have been opened and really expanded and occupying big space over high stem density and low cover, then you have mast coming down over cover, which is a really unique kind of condition that might only happen where you have those 2 distinct layers happening. We've also kind of focused on soft mast releases of things like serviceberry and some of these mid-canopy species that we see as really important, and overall maintaining that diversity of species. So when we look at these places, we often look at them and think, well, this is pretty cool. It's got some old forest elements in this structural complexity, but boy, when you walk through them, they really have a lot of features that we associate favorably with young stands that we think are great for early successional species. So this is kind of, we started throwing around this term just within ourselves, that this, maybe it's a 30% solution. If it's 30% as good as early succession and actually showing some early successional habitat features, maybe it becomes a marginal place that's used by early successional species nearby other areas that have more like turnover of acres that's creating new and continuous opportunities for early succession. But because it's a late successional system that's going to be managed persistently in this way to keep this type of cover and structure, it's a persistent, though suboptimal version of early successional. So we see this as a thing that kind of extends the envelope of all of the other types of management around us, and therefore really important in a strategic place in that landscape context. Do you want to mention Kirk there?
This is one of our, it's actually the forester for the game lands that we're going to be talking about here. And I mean, we routinely flush grouse in these, you know, late successional stands. There's rabbits all through them. And I think it's because of that variability in structure that includes areas of like quite high stem density with all the woody debris. So yeah, it has kind of altered our thinking on what wildlife species are going to benefit from this type of work. So we're going to kind of like focus in on a few projects now, and it's on this game lands that we looked at earlier, and it's in those dark green stands at the southern end that are circled there, that are really in a highly managed landscape. Like a lot of the lighter green areas have been harvested recently, so there's some, you know, quite a few young forest patches, and a lot of the stands in dark green were designated because they were important areas to maintain as mature forest habitat for the long term. A lot of them had pretty decent regen. They had some existing complex structure from previous management. They had some scattered big wolfy oaks, a decent conifer component, which is important to us, and not a lot of invasives. So that's just some of the pre-existing attributes of these stands. And so we'll go through a couple of them now. So the first one is pretty interesting. Commercially thinned in 1993, so that we had no late successional designation back then. So it was thinned. It really created kind of a two-age stand where there were residual oaks in the overstory, mostly white oak, but it regenerated kind of a second age class of cherry, red maple, serviceberry, and a few oaks. And then kind of when we got to it, it had this pole layer of those species in kind of a very patchy way. So we already saw like the opportunity because it had this complex structure forming. So a bunch of those overstory oaks died in 2008, 9, 10 because of a spongy moth outbreak. And they were salvaged, and that reduced the basal area of the big trees to like down to 30 to 60 BA. So you can see in that top picture, the big trees are kind of scattered. Probably not as many as you'd like to have, but you know, that's just the hand we're dealt there. But a bunch of regen got established during that period, period of relatively low deer pressure. And so the forester at the time kind of saw this opportunity to go in 2017 and release some of those competitive oak seedlings, really make a third age class, and kind of work through some of that pole cherry also. So in that bottom picture, you can kind of see that kind of on the bottom left side of that picture is like a patch of that pole cherry, and then there's a kind of residual patch of big oaks. So that's kind of what this stand looks like.
You can also see some of the serviceberry. When we took these drone shots, they were in flower, so they stand out really well in these pictures.
Yep. So this was completed quite a few years ago, and so our approach then with these stands was very much like an area-wide prep cut approach, which we're probably going to change a little bit going forward, but it worked out pretty well in these stands. So this one basically had an area-wide prescription to cut all the 1 to 10 inch red maple and black birch. It was pretty much that simple. And so those were mostly those 30+ year old poles. And kind of working through thinning some of those cherry pockets, and we really didn't do anything with that residual oak overstory because there just wasn't enough of them to lose any. And so 7 years later, what we see in this stand is really successful release of that oak sapling layer. So now we have pockets of 10 to 15 foot tall oak saplings mixed with serviceberry. The pole cherry and serviceberry have continued to progress and form like a really nice mid-story pockets in places. But any future treatments in here, we really have to defer because we cut kind of too many of the trees we don't like in the first entry. We had really good regeneration results, but at this point the woody debris that we cut is breaking down and almost gone. There's not a lot of wood left over from the previous harvest, and because we pretty much cut all the undesirable mid-story trees, we didn't retain anything that we want to lose. So now mostly what's left are big oaks and kind of those pole cherries. So we learned that lesson here, that our ability to continuously provide those structural features kind of is going to be a challenge here.
So to kind of like call back to some of those management concepts that Tony and Paul talked about and that we've kind of hinted at in our primary objectives, what happened in this project was looking at an opportunity and reacting to it. So Tony talked about emulating natural disturbance patterns. In this case, it was observing and seeing a natural disturbance pattern happen and then reacting to it. So there was an existing opportunity that's a low-hanging fruit. We got to go for it. And that mid-story structure really was like tended and plussed up. So that mid-story structure in this case, thinking about the trajectory, comes from two places: things that will stay, the serviceberry, witch hazel, some of the conifer elements, and mid-story structure that will eventually succeed to the main canopy and give us more options. So those cherry poles and the regeneration that we see in those places. So the approaches were designed to respond to those opportune pockets to release them. And then here, not saying like, well, we ran out of deadwood options to really create new pulses for a while, I guess we won't do late succession there, but just adjusting the goals for the trajectory of that stand to deprioritize some of those structural goals for now, to accommodate the realities of stand development and look for those opportunities later. So in this case, one entry started things, and then the stand caught this stochastic disturbance of the spongy moth mortality, which then we reacted to. So it's a kind of a combination of light management and then reactionary management in this case. We'll also mention that we had some validation of this 30% concept that we have, that young forest species can use these stands and do use these stands. You can read faster than we can talk, but Dr. Jeff Larkin did some work in here of detections of both mature forest birds as well as young forest preferring birds that were occupying this space and using the structure there.
So another project, it's somewhat similar. It had two previous commercial harvests in 87 and 95 that resulted in residual oak basal area of about 50, plus all the conifer was reserved at that time. So there's quite a good conifer component in this one, which is cool for us. And also those foresters back then retained all the serviceberry and all the witch hazel. So you have these kind of old growth witch hazel patches in there, which is pretty neat. That 95 harvest similarly resulted in regen pockets that were now pole maple, birch, and cherry, and kind of wolfy white pines, with a really nice wildlife shrub understory and a bunch of oak regen that had accumulated during between the 90s and the mid 2000s. So once again, forester Aaron Tyson, he recognized this opportunity, and to kind of get a third cohort developed to kind of thin through that pole layer to kind of increase tree growth there. And that was the aim of this project. So this one was kind of an area-wide prescription by description, focusing on cutting the red maple and black birch poles, and also thin through the cherry pockets to kind of create some crown stratification within those pockets, daylighting wildlife shrubs, and most importantly, releasing those pockets of oak regen. So that resulted in basically about all the 1 to 8 inch maple and birch were cut, some cherry also, and a few larger white pine here and there. So 7 growing seasons later, same thing. We got a really good release of the oak and other desirable regen. So we have a definite 3rd age class going. You can start to see some dominant cherry forming in that 2nd age class, which is adding to that structural complexity. The nice thing about this one is there are still sufficient 8 to 14 inch kind of small saw timber red maple and some white pine that we don't really need. We're happy to have those there now because we can use them to cut or girdle later to expand gaps, further release that regen, and help us meet those structural goals. Interestingly, in this one, there's still a lot of woody debris from that 1995 oak harvest. There's a lot of top wood still laying in there. So that's adding some structural complexity as well.
I'll notice here on these pictures, you can really see how the prescription by description approach, kind of scenario-based approaches to marking, really helps kind of show like these little sort of variable patches in the application of those prescriptions. So here, a lot of the same concepts underlie this project. It was reacting to opportunities. It sort of assures that mid-story structure. The thing I really want to focus on here that's different is that here, really explicitly, the scenario prescriptions targeted every cohort stage of development. So there's overstory manipulation, there's tending of poles, there's attention to regeneration. So you're doing stand tending as well as regeneration opportunities in the same entry, which is really what you need once you get into these three cohort systems.
So the last one here we'll talk about, it's called Miles Run. So this one is kind of more useful to look at for a lot of folks, I think, because it's more representative of what we have a lot of places. Unmanaged stand, never had any previous harvest that we know of course, since it was clear cut in 1910 or something. It had some limited spongy moth mortality in the overstory 15 years ago or so, and that increased light level kind of spurred the development of some mid-story species. It also established a nice cohort of oak regen. This was an area that was just surrounded by a lot of even age management, and it was identified as an important place to retain as a mature forest patch. So the goals here were focused on releasing the competitive oak kind of across the whole stand, and increasing woody debris in particular to help protect the seedlings from deer browse and elk browse in the case of this place. So just looking at like an uncut area to a cut area, you get a lot more overstory than the last couple stands, and a lot more trees were cut in here because it hadn't been managed before. So a lot more woody debris was created. So this was another area-wide prescription. Mostly it was kind of like a preparatory cut because we're really focused on developing that competitive oak regen, but where possible, we cut it a little bit harder to release patches of existing oak and conifer and serviceberry. So the bottom picture is a picture of a gap that we kind of walked and estimated that it was maybe 1/4 of an acre or a little bit less than 1/4 of an acre. That was the biggest gap we could find, and kind of all the woody debris laying there. So non-utilization in this entry. So this stand has never had any utilization as far as we know. Now, 7 or 8 years later, really good response from the regen layer. There's a lot more structural things going on in this stand because the large oak that died from spongy moth are still there, creating some big snags and big woody debris. The variable cutting based on the amount of regen has created a lot of horizontal structural complexity. And we got plenty of residual trees that we don't care about that much to kill or cut later to kind of continue building structural complexity. And for all these stands, the issue going forward is deer pressure is really increased in this landscape, and our ability to establish additional cohorts is kind of in doubt. So just some nice pictures of it. We're kind of running toward the end, so we'll blow through a few slides here and then wrap it up.
Yeah, just to reinforce, this project really highlights the concept of there was a lot of nearby early successional work happening. So a lot of clear cuts, a lot of overstory removals. This was sort of a strategic location to hold some complex overstory structure. And this one was that approach to a more intact stand. So that area-wide prep was something about like reacting to the current opportunities, but also setting up the future, not just creating holes and hoping something happens. It was kind of a combination of both things to start things moving, but in terms of regeneration environment, but also responding to exact opportunities to do direct gap releases.
So we won't really talk about these, just some other pictures of kind of the area-wide approach that we've taken and some other stands, you know, several years after the treatment. This is a little time series of a more traditional group selection that has been done in smoke stands. So that's pre-cut, year 1, year 2, year 3. So we're watching that development over time.
I just want to mention too that we've kind of focused in on these oak projects because it's kind of a tough nut to crack when you think about these concepts of like high complexity structure and things that we learned from old growth themselves when you're talking about an intermediately shade tolerant system that requires this certain kind of disturbance. But we're doing other approaches in other forest types. A few of the other practices that we're implementing that have implications and opportunities in late succession. Some of our work, we've started using concepts of sub-blocks within an area to prescribe a certain amount of uniformity or non-uniformity in our approaches. That may be something that we start to use in late successional prescriptions. We hinted at some of these scenario-based prescription approaches, which are really commonly reaching for, and the example on the right from Game Lands 13 in the Northeast region, Forester Evan Delp came up with prescription approaches for gap releases in a more mixed wood system. Some expanding gap and gap adjacent thinning cuts from more like traditional Femmelschlag approaches. But also we're doing some interesting things in earlier, younger forests that were maybe designated for late succession, where some non-uniform variable density resets happen, where regeneration was unfavorable. So then you end up with 2 cohorts at age 30 or 40. And that sets a good trajectory for multi-age management. Even though you don't have the big trees yet, you can move towards them. Degraded stands may also offer opportunities to really focus on structure and just try to like rescue or lifeboat those areas and reach for increased diversity and resiliency.
So we've mentioned a few of these things. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but just kind of wrapping it up, we think it's important to be opportunistic and adaptive and watching as things change. If you cut all the trees you don't like at once, then you don't have anything to cut later. So don't do that. Watching our current spongy moth outbreak kill some of our overstory oak has really validated our approach to focus on kind of species resilience. And stands that have a ton of challenges are kind of hard to fit into this approach, and might just be better and sometimes suited to even age management, where you can kind of throw everything at it at once. And with high deer pressure, this approach can be a real problem. And that, structure isn't something you can create it right now, but it goes away over time. So it really is a process, not a single target. So we'll just end here that we don't even know if this is late successional management that we're doing, but we're not really sure what else to call it. Our approach is on developing multiple desirable cohorts, and structural attributes are really important. So we think it fits.
Thank you both, Sarah and Dan. That was excellent. It's interesting to see some patterns come out from Tony and Paul's conversation in your presentation without that being planned, and also some nuance that kind of contributes to the conversation and shows the on the ground lived experience that you all have had doing this, learning from doing. We will take questions at our break, which we'll have in another half hour. But before our break, we're going to hear from Britt Townsend and Sean Bowers from the Nature Conservancy. Britt is a conservation forester with TNC in Tennessee, and Sean is the Appalachian conservation forester with TNC in Kentucky. So I will turn it over to Britt and Sean.
Thanks, Will. Let me get my screen shared here. Can everyone see that?
Yes, looks good, Sean.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, good morning, everybody. Definitely, like like Will had mentioned, it's great to see some patterns through all these presentations and how we're all kind of focusing in on the same similar sort of goals and walking through these processes as we are really trying to get this late successional management implemented and the thought process as we walk through all this. And today Britt and I are going to kind of talk about a project that we've got ongoing out at the Catoosa Wildlife Management area, translating the ecological goals, especially like we have used from Tony's research into something that works more for our local regionally sub-adapted forests. And so, first, it wouldn't be a TNC presentation if I didn't give a shout out to our partners, the folks at RGS, TWRA, and then other folks from TNC have been instrumental in getting this off the ground. Thanks to Will and Katie Shallows for kind of setting us up to be able to do this sort of work in our region and really make this a cooperative process where we can all work together to really get this project off the ground and implemented and do some learning along the way while also improving conditions throughout our region. And so in my second point there, which is mentioned, it's kind of an experimental design for us, as there wasn't a lot of previous research or implementation in this region of the country that we could draw from. So when we were doing this, we did draw a lot from the more northern implementations of it, but our southern forests are a bit more locally adapted for some different conditions. So we had to spend a lot of thought time with ourselves and the partners to figure out how to implement this on these forests in our areas. And so with this project, it takes place in a dynamic forest restoration block, which RGS has piloted here. And the large acreage units, 5,000 plus acres of both private and public land, to achieve that kind of landscape scale heterogeneity in forest management for bird and wildlife species habitat improvement. And so what we're seeing currently is the two simple forest structures. We've got these forests that were harvested in the early 20th century, late 19th century, that then without the management taking place on those, we're seeing very similar uniform maple dominated or oak dominated forests with a large maple yellow poplar understory throughout the region. So the simple forest structure is really contributing to a loss of biodiversity, habitat, forest resilience. Hydrology is declining and is being affected. And so with the project within this DFRB, our goal was to implement a more varied forest structure at a landscape scale. That's at least the long-term goal of this project. While we're working on a kind of a relatively small acreage, we're hoping to be able to translate this into a larger, more landscape scale format for management that then can improve management across the region. And so our project's taking place at the Catoosa WMA, which is a great forest playground with 96,000 acres with a variety of forest types, forest management. There's savanna, woodlands, closed forests, native grasslands, all sorts of different landscape units that really all come together in this area that give a lot of views at the different management techniques and allow for us to look at how this management's affecting all sorts of different habitat types in a relatively small area while still being able to implement what we're looking to have accomplished. And so here's a little bit of a map of our treatment areas. So the areas in pink are our late successional management units. And so they're both in Morgan County, Tennessee, between, I think it's about 15 to 1,600 foot elevation. And they're both about 30 acres in size for our treatment units. And they, some about 60 acres in total. They had a previous harvest under the WMA management plan in about the 50s, leaving 60-ish square foot residual basal area, creating a 2-age structure with a 70-year-old mid-story, 150-year-old overstory. And so these stand structures currently as they are, there was an arson fire in 2016 that was a really high intensity fire event caused a lot of structural variation, burned a lot of the areas up that really it became an uncontrolled wildfire there for a while. So it was a high intensity fire that really seriously affected the structure of these areas. And then the southern pine beetle kill in 2000 also took a lot of the large overstory pine component out of those stands. And so other than those events, there's been pretty little intervention in these stands since the 1950s. That led to an understory dominated by, your species like red maple, sugar maple, yellow poplar. And with that pine beetle kill, there's a large understory component of white pine, which has formed a super dense understory, really kind of limited the development of oak hickory seedlings and structure in that understory area. And so as the current stands condition, we've divided them the west and east stand, 30 acres each, 150-ish square foot of basal area. And it's an oak hickory dominant forest up here on the Cumberland Plateau with these kind of acidic, thinner soils. And so with a little intervention, it's pretty typical of what we've seen of forests across the Cumberland Plateau. You get a large, your overstory component, as well as some dense understory, typically dominated by red maple, yellow poplar, these fast growing shade intolerant species. And so these stands currently as they are overstocked, large variation in DBH range. And then, they're very closed canopy, not conducive to oak growth, hickory growth. And so the east stand, just like the west stand, is pretty similar. So in our choosing of these units, we wanted to find forests that were representative as kind of a whole of the conditions on many of our forests on the Cumberland Plateau. And so really these, we see this all over the region with what we're looking at. And so in our choosing of these two areas, they were pretty representative of what we were trying to emulate for hopefully when we can replicate this on a larger scale. And so taking that and taking the goals from Tony's publication, and I really liked what Sarah and Dan said about how late successional isn't an end condition, it's more of a machine that's going to continue to produce these conditions, and it's not a end goal, it's a process here. So with our goals, we wanted to retain our overstory, especially that oak hickory component, that variation throughout with the heterogeneity throughout the stand, and then like was mentioned earlier, that input of down deadwood as well as some standing snags, and that down deadwood, especially larger deadwood that's not going to be broken down nearly as quickly, as well as I'm sure it's many of our goals, the regeneration of oak and hickory, as well as variation in structure, like I mentioned, the snags, tip up mounds from the overstory mortality with these stands. We're not really going to be able to get in with heavy machinery, so we're going to rely on wind events to create these tip up mounds when the overstory does die, and hopefully can get those micro habitat variations and structure variations from that, as well as these forests are fire adapted. And so the fire adapted plant communities with the restricted fire regime that we've had, hopefully we can promote these fire adapted communities as we conduct this management within the stands. Britt, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take it over. Thanks, Sean. If you could, yeah, you can leave it right here on this slide. So I just want to emphasize that, we are at the very beginning stages of this project. We just started, we just got the funding last fall. We have been working as a team very closely with RGS and TWRA's foresters to think through this. As Sean had mentioned, there was a long thought process on not only the ecological goals, but particularly these prescriptions on how we can manage for late successional characteristics in this fire adapted forest. So the ecological goals that Sean just had up on the screen are very familiar to all of us, right? They came from Tony and Paul's research, mostly in these northern Appalachian forests, but as you see, Catoosa is not a northern hardwood forest. So we spent a lot of time on Zoom meetings discussing these ecological goals and how they fit in a southern Appalachian forest, right? A dry, fire-adapted oak, hickory, pine forest in Tennessee. So we stuck with many of the tried and true ecological goals of the Northern Appalachian Forest research, retaining old trees, but with an emphasis on leaving oaks. That's a very important component in our oak, hickory, pine forests here in the South. Improving spatial variation in multiple canopy layers, but with an emphasis on promoting oak regeneration, particularly white oak regeneration. And lastly, as Sean mentioned, these are fire adapted communities. So promoting species that can tolerate at least some interval of fire is really important to maintain. So we needed to come up with treatments that make the most sense for how we achieve these goals. And like I mentioned, as a team, we had a lot of discussion around what prescriptions make sense, where and when. So I'm going to go through a few of these with you, but I would invite you to ask questions or email Sean and I if you'd like to discuss specifics further. One of the hot topics for this team was how and what method we were going to use to promote regeneration in this late successional forest. And we opted for creating a series of gaps and reserves that would mimic a patchwork of sorts or a mosaic of closed and open canopies. How big and how many gaps depends on how open or closed the canopy should be. And we had a great discussion in the woods on whether or not we were managing the site to be a late successional woodland or a late successional closed canopy forest. So up here on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee and Kentucky, we had both of those systems were present on the landscape. So we agreed after some discussion that we would manage for the latter. And so we actually went back and reduced our gap sizes to mimic those very small disturbances such as strong wind events that are pretty common here on the plateau that remove 1 or 2 large trees from the canopy. And in order to maintain these closed canopy characteristics of late successional oak hickory forest, we kept the gap sizes small, so anywhere from 1/10 to 1/4 of an acre, with no more than 10% of the stand in gaps. So we also recognize that in order to maintain this particular species diversity and canopy cover, we needed to reserve areas from any sort of treatment. So we established reserves, which were generally areas that have a strong oak component in the overstory, or were serving as a transition zone between adjacent stands that were being managed for other things. So while these stands have a lot of good late successional characteristics in place, the west stand, Sean had showed a picture of that earlier, it needs quite a bit of work in order to create the diverse midstory that we're looking for. So the Catoosa WMA has quite an overabundance of white pine on the landscape from past management practices decades ago that promoted planting of white pine and just general fire suppression. And while we think white pine was a small component of late successional forests on the plateau, almost the entire midstory, particularly in the west stand, is composed of white pine. So we're going to be using fire as a tool to help us thin out white pine in the midstory, and we'll be using herbicides to reduce some of the other hardwood species like red maple and yellow poplar that are fire intolerant. So next slide, Sean. There we go. Okay. So this was a map created by RGS, and Nick and his team did a fantastic job in helping us put together a management plan for these stands. And so Nick's team developed kind of just a sketch here of what this looks like. And this is, again, we're going to just focus in on the west stand. Yeah, but both sites are very similar. So the green patches are gaps, and then the pink patches are reserves, and then there's a light blue area that designates a crop tree release. So we've got some nice white oak in the mid-story, and we're gonna release those white oak in that area. The large pink area kind of in that southwestern corner is a transitional zone. So that's a large reserve that we're leaving. It's got a lot of the oak and hickory component in the overstory that we're looking for. It also is sort of a buffer. You can kind of see in that lower corner there, it looks like a clear cut, but that was actually a wildfire that happened in 2016. And so the pink area, that large block there is quite open as the fire pushed in to the stand and was able to thin out some of the mid-story. And it's just a really great buffer, like a transition zone between kind of this hard open area and kind of a more closed canopy system. So we thought we would leave this as a reserve. So, oh, we got a question. How many acres is this whole area on the slide? So this is about 30 acres. So we've got 2 stands that we're implementing these treatments on, 60 acres total between the 2 stands, but each stand is 30 acres in size. So next slide, Sean. Yeah, keep questions coming. So again, can't take credit for any of this. Many thanks to Nick and his team. He's got a great forester, Zach, who was able to plug in some of these the stand conditions in FVS, and then show us some really cool current and post treatments. And so this is just an example for all of you visual learners out there of again, we're looking at the west stand, and we're looking at a current gap or a current area that we're going to create a gap in, and then what it would look like post treatment. So, and again, we will be using mostly hack and squirt and girdling to create these gaps in these particular stands. So we were unable to do a commercial timber harvest in this area for a number of reasons. So we're going to be using fire and herbicide as our primary tools for regeneration. Next. So another model here for our mid-story removal. Again, a lot of the stand, the entire mid-story is just full of white pine. I have a picture here, I believe, on the next slide, just to show you. And again, we'll use fire to help us thin out that mid-story so that we can hopefully get some good regeneration of our focal species, or our oaks, our hickories, and other species that we want to see hopefully regenerate in this area. Next. Okay, yeah, so here's a couple pictures, just again, of current conditions. We were out in the field last week, actually, so this presentation is like hot off the press. So we were out with RGS and TWRA there on the left-hand side, standing in what will be a gap. You can see the white pine presence in the mid-story, and really just prevents anything else from regenerating in that area. And we're okay with leaving some white pine as a component of the stand. As I mentioned, historically, we think we would have seen at least a little bit of white pine in this area. But there's just an overabundance of it. And so we need to almost kind of go back to set this stand up for what we're trying to achieve. And I think being able to return fire back to this area and try and thin out some of this mid-story will help us improve some regeneration. And then next on the right is the picture of a reserve. This is that large pink block that I showed you in that southwest corner. That's that transitional zone between our late successional closed canopy forest management and then that 2016 wildfire on the other side. So you can see it's quite open, and we think this is going to be a great transition zone between these two areas. Next. Okay, so we talked about like having late successional characteristics already present in these areas, and Sean talked about why there was already some really good characteristics, and this is one of the reasons why we chose these stands. So we've got an incredible amount of snags already present in these areas. These were actually white pine mortality from pine beetle. And these are everywhere, and they're great habitat for, as we all know, for bats and woodpeckers. And so having these already present, these standing dead snags in the overstory is definitely great to see. We've got tip up mounds. I wouldn't say that they're 100% natural tip up mounds. This was kind of left over from some road maintenance, construction, long time ago, decades ago, but they're here, and we've got sensitive plants that are growing on these tip up mounds, and they're scattered throughout the stand. So again, nice to see that we've already got some of these characteristics in place. Next. And then lastly is our timeline. I mentioned we're right, at the start of this project. We're going to be starting treatments this fall with our herbicide and girdling. We're going to be putting in a fire line so we can actually do the first fire in the stand, and we hope to achieve that burn in the spring of 2025. So I'll end by saying that, like nearly probably all of us at some point came to this project having never managed a forest or stand for late successional characteristics. So the Nature Conservancy manages a large property about an hour south of Catoosa, which is also another Cumberland Plateau oak hickory forest. But up until this point, we've been really focused on managing this forest for oak and shortleaf pine woodlands, not necessarily late successional habitat. But when I heard about this project, I was really intrigued. So I'm always looking for ways to connect TNC's forest conservation strategies with private landowners, and managing a forest for late successional characteristics could be a really great way to introduce many landowners to forest management who may not be interested in pursuing these, a larger scale commercial timber harvest, or altering their forest in a way that could affect, private landowners' number one reason for owning land, which is to preserve the beauty of their property, right? So it's a light footprint, a light touch that I feel like it would be a really, really great introduction into forest management for a lot of landowners. And then, lastly, as some of you might be aware, TNC and AFF are rolling out our Family Forest Carbon Program here in the South. We've done this successfully in other parts of the country. But this is just naturally, as you might expect, there are some timber harvest restrictions on carbon programs, and our Family Forest Carbon Program is no different. But this relatively light impact of managing a forest for late successional characteristics does a number of things that align with the carbon program, right? This strategy for management fosters, habitat for different species who depend on late successional forests. It retains the beauty of big old trees, because what landowner doesn't love big, beautiful trees? But it also promotes the storage of carbon. So this pilot project at Catoosa could potentially demonstrate another way private and state lands could manage particular forest stands for carbon storage, while also promoting, other ecological benefits and aesthetics. Oh, okay. We got some questions coming in.
Hey, Britt,
Yeah,
in
do
the
we have
interest of
time or
time,
no?
let's go ahead and take our break. But if you all are okay to stick around and field questions during the break, I think that'll keep us on track. So thank you all
Sounds
for
good.
asking questions. Keep them coming in the chat. But we will officially return to this group at 11:20, at which time we'll go into breakout sessions where the presenters and the project team will help facilitate some important questions. I can see the virtual eye rolls now, as I mentioned, breakout sessions. But this is very much a two-way street. We don't have all the answers. And so we're also looking to you all to help build this community of practice as a group, not just a one-directional communication avenue. So we'll do a half an hour breakout session starting back at 11:20. In the meantime, if you all have any questions for Britt or Sean or for Dan and Sarah, please put them in the chat and they will answer them during the break. Maybe we'll start, I'm just looking at my screen here. Katie, you're the first one on my list who is leading facilitation in the room. Do you or your co-facilitator mind giving us a recap?
Sure. Do you want me to go through each of the questions we got through or just stick with the first question?
Each of the questions. Our group bounced around some. So big takeaways from each of the questions that you got to.
Big takeaway from the first question of how does late successional forest management fit into your suite of management options, and whether folks were working on private or public lands, they all felt like this is very helpful and fits within their options for forest diversity. We had some folks who work with private landowners, and in the past, the logging and mill industry has been more robust, but since that's taken a hit recently, this is a path forward to help folks along in managing for forest diversity. We talked about how these sites could be great demonstration sites for private landowners in the future to learn from and see options for how else to manage their lands. For site characteristics, folks talked about big trees being a key search image, big trees and species that live a long time, sites where the stand is not on the right or in a healthy trajectory, sites that have NNIS issues, are currently not very diverse. Several folks noted, and I captured what Sean said about this, that working towards managing for late successional old growth traits has been the biggest juggle of deciphering various activities and targets for his career. And thinking about how we do this, not just on public lands, but how it can be translated to private lands has been, a challenging question to work through. And it's great that we're all working on this together. Those are some of the highlights.
Great, thank you. Next on my list, I've got Ben, Chase, or Sarah/Dan. If you all can give a recap of your room.
Sure. So we only asked one question, but maybe hit on two or three. So really, as far as how it fits into the suite of management options, we talked some about sort of balancing like the idea of restoration versus managing for function. And how that can vary with or define your objectives really. Also, that talking about late successional is fairly new, at least for the Pennsylvania Game Commission and probably for all of us at large, but this kind of management's been happening. And so in some ways there's a shift, but in other ways, like management from 20-30 years ago has had these sort of set the stage well for further late successional management. And then moving on to site characteristics, some of that came out in conversation, mainly around importance of thinking opportunistically, seeing old remnants and with blowdowns and structure where previously there was a spongy moth outbreak or something like that, like you have these little remnant pockets that may be slated for even age management, but have good late successional characteristics. Also, the importance of doing this kind of work in young stands was highlighted, not just sort of older, more mature stands. So changing that trajectory early on. And then also we talked a little bit about mesification, oak stands converting to, maples and birch, where maybe a priority should be regenerating versus late successional. Could those be complementary? I think might be an open question based on, what else is happening in sort of the social construct that you're working in. And then, just one big question or challenge that we got to was here in Pennsylvania, how to deal with deer. The Game Commission, late successional, and Dan or Sarah, correct me, but like the strategy really kind of hinges on having multiple cohorts. And so if you can't regenerate another cohort or have big challenges, it can pose some challenges for late successional management. Anything I missed or that y'all want to add in there?
I see a thumbs up from Sarah. So the next is Paboda, Sean, and Nick. Can you all give a synopsis of your room?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So for the first question, in terms of how late successional management fits in, some folks said they were similar to the last group, already doing this type of management. They just didn't label it necessarily as late successional management. And so I guess just thinking about it in a new context was something that came up. And then sort of ways that they could continue to build upon what had already been done. I think folks expressed some ideas that they picked up today that they might be able to incorporate into their suite of management options moving forward. And then for the second question, site characteristics, we did discuss how Sarah and Dan brought up that sometimes a challenging looking stand can actually be more fruitful for late successional management. And so that was sort of just a new way of thinking for some folks in our breakout session. And then in terms of site characteristics, we talked about how a lot of places where we can do this type of management can be done in traditionally hard to access areas. So maybe we already have some places where commercial viability isn't really an option. And so we can think about doing some more, non-commercial work in those areas and sort of just using those site characteristics to our advantage. Questions that came up. So sort of this passive versus active management. So, if we are actively managing to get to a certain point for a stand to reach a certain set of conditions, if at some point we do want to take a hands-off approach, how do you decide when that is something that came up? And then also, the big question that came up was just how do you pay for this at scale? So, a lot of this work is going to be really expensive if there's not a commercial component to it. So just thinking about how do we sort of do this type of management at a cost point that makes sense. In terms of what people were bringing home from the workshop, we talked about Tony and Paul's presentation and how that talked about benchmarks and how benchmarks can be used by foresters to create and integrate certain prescriptions. So I think that's definitely an interesting takeaway from that side of things. And then in terms of limitations, I think the big thing was the commercial side of it, as I've already mentioned, and then also just the cultural piece right now is challenging, and I think this workshop is sort of helping us think about different management strategies. But at the moment, late successional management is fairly new and undefined across landscapes, and so just figuring out how to eventually create a more cohesive strategy around it is something we talked about. So I think that pretty much covers it. Might have missed a couple things, but in the interest of time, we'll keep moving on.
Great, thanks, Sean. And then from the room that Britt and I facilitated for our first question, most of the folks in the room were relatively new to late successional or in a learning mode or starting to think about where to implement or how to implement. A couple folks had done successful late successional projects, mainly focused on cerulean warbler. But for the most part, the room seemed representative of the larger audience, and what I've heard from other rooms that late successional is still very undefined, and we're learning, and it's new, and there's a lot of potentially right answers and probably a lot of potentially wrong answers on how to do it, but we're still feeling around for where it makes the most sense to do it, how to measure it, and how to define success. We then kind of pivoted to big questions and future needs. Similar to Sean's room, we talked some about the public and noting that members of the public have a wide variety of opinions on late successional and old growth forests, and that the public isn't a monolith. And how do you explain what late successional or old growth focused management is to the public or to a private landowner, and meet them where they're at for their needs, their goals, and explain it in a meaningful way. We talked about how to monitor. How do we define success? What are we looking for? Are there metrics? I also talked about the need for prescriptions, so that as we're doing pretty undefined, hand-wavy sort of ecology right now, distilling it down into a prescription that you could give to a silviculturalist and say, like, tweak this based on the stand that you're seeing, what you've walked on the ground. That's definitely a future need, and kind of trying to actualize this work so that it's implementable at scale. And similar to the at scale question, we also talked about how to fund it. There's political momentum right now, but with like commercial work will not be the way to do every single late successional project. It may be a way to do some, but how do we fund it to do this at scale and not just making a bunch of one-off demonstration sites that we talk about fondly but aren't having a really big landscape level impact. Lastly, we wanted to talk about a little bit of how to do multiple reentries, which kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of how do we monitor, what benchmarks are we looking for. If we're doing an entry and coming back in 15 years, how are we codifying what we're doing, but also managing adaptively across careers, across organizations, and across ownerships, so that this work builds upon itself and that we're not having the same conversation in 15 years. But that it's continuing to grow. So those are the big takeaways from our groups. I think we've got about 7 or 8 minutes, Amanda. Is that right? If anybody has some burning questions or things that we missed, feel free to throw it out to the group.
I just wanted to add something real briefly. I really enjoyed that Sarah and Dan ended their presentation by saying, we're not really sure if this is late successional management, what we're doing. And I think one of the breakout groups also said, like, oh, we're doing this, but that's not what we call it. So one of the big things that has come out of my work with TNC and the team focused on this is that there are huge communication needs in this space and with this work. And so we are really interested in hearing your thoughts. Please, follow up with me in email or in the chat. Are there other ways that you communicate about this work? Is there something else that you call it? Do you have ideas about what we should be calling it or how we should talk about it? I think there are really big needs there to make sure that we are not alienating people from this work by the word choices that we're making before they even get the chance to see what we're really talking about. So that's something that I'm really interested in, and I think someone out there has the idea and the answer for how we should talk about this work. So if you have any ideas, I would really love to hear them.
I see Jason put in the chat the terminology old forest characteristics. I mean, I think that's great. Late successional is a pretty wonky term if we're talking to the public, but people get what old forest is pretty self-explanatory, and then those characteristics are kind of those metrics and benchmarks that we've talked about trying to define for different forest types. Yeah. Well, waiting for another awkward silence, maybe we'll go ahead and finish out with Sean and Nick from RGS. They'll be closing out our presentations today. Sean has been working with us to help plan this virtual workshop. And he's a forest conservation coordinator with RGS in Southern Appalachia, and Nick is the forest conservation director for RGS. So I will turn it over to them with the final presentation of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Give me a second to pull up the presentation and share my screen. We'll be good to go. All right, cool. Can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Good. Great. So thanks so much to everyone that helped pull together this event. Really happy to be here with everyone today. As was mentioned, Nick Miller. I am the Forest Conservation Director for the Southern Appalachian region with Ruffed Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. I am based in Western North Carolina. I manage our regional conservation program across the mountain regions of 6 states, which for us is North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Southwest Virginia. So I'm going to talk to you all today about some of our work, about dynamic forest restoration blocks in the region, and some stuff that we're doing relating to late successional management. So first, for those that might be less familiar with us, RGS and AWS is a national conservation nonprofit. Our mission is to promote healthy forests and abundant wildlife. Obviously, as our name implies, ruffed grouse and American woodcock are our 2 primary flagship species. But when we think about our conservation work, we really are thinking about healthy forests, abundant wildlife, and conservation ethics in the broader senses of the words. So why ruffed grouse? I do want to give a little bit of species-specific information about ruffed grouse here in the Southern Appalachians. So we know that we've lost over 71% of ruffed grouse population abundance over the past 3 decades, and that is a pretty concerning, pretty steep decline for a species over only a 3-decade period. We know that the primary driver of that decline is the lack of habitat diversity, and specifically the lack of young forest conditions, those actively regenerating 5 to 20-year-old forests that provide that high stem density and critical cover for grouse and a lot of wildlife for parts of their life cycle needs. But it's not just about young forest when we think about grouse. It's about the interspersion and the juxtaposition of young forest stands with other more diverse forest conditions, including that landscape level diversity of the right amount of early, mid, and late successional forests at functional landscape scales that have biologically significant impact. Here in the Southern Appalachians, we think about grouse as a bellwether to grouse populations further north. This is the southernmost extent of ruffed grouse's range in the eastern United States. The continued declines that we've seen of the species here, with grouse being a climate-sensitive bird, does not look good for grouse in other parts of its range further north where it is more abundant. So declines down here are indicative of ongoing future declines that we can expect further north, making this area really ground zero when it comes to grouse conservation in the eastern United States. We also think about grouse as an umbrella species and that their decline is consistent with the decline of a broad suite of at-risk wildlife, including those traditionally considered to be more early successional obligates, but also species that are often thought about as more mature forest obligates, but we know require more structural diversity, both kind of at the stand level and also at the landscape level than a lot of our forest landscapes currently provide. We also think about grouse as an indicator in that they are an indicator for healthy and resilient forest ecosystems that have high age class and structural diversity. I wanted to kind of frame some of this conversation about different desired ecological conditions, about how much late successional forest compared to how much young forest within the concept of ecological integrity, because I think it's a really useful framework. And so, I hate to share too many kind of quotes with people during presentations, but I'll share a couple with you here. Ecological integrity, as defined by the Forest Service in their 2012 planning rule, is the quality or condition of an ecosystem when its dominant ecological characteristics occur within the natural range of variation and can withstand and recover from most perturbances imposed by both environmental dynamics and human influences. Another term that I'll share is ecological zones or ecozones. And ecozones are basically units of land that have specific plant communities or plant community groups based on environmental factors and are driven by things like elevation, aspect, landform, soil moisture, and soil types. This is one of my favorite images that we have for the Southern Blue Ridge, for the Southern Apps. One thing about doing work in the Southern Appalachians is we have a really high diversity of different site conditions. Elevation is synonymous with latitude in the Southern Apps. So we have all of the major forest communities that you would see if you went from Georgia to Maine, but all within these mountains. So when we think about those different sites and we think about these different ecological zones and dominant characteristics across the landscape, the way that we think about ecological integrity varies depending upon the ecological zone and the forest community type that you're operating within. And so here is a breakdown of different natural range of variation structural classes by ecozone for the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forests in North Carolina. So this is a NRV model that was part of an ecological departure analysis that the Forest Service completed as part of their new forest plan revision process. And so just the one thing I want to point out is, this model highlights what the best available science tells us different structural classes were by ecozone pre-Euro-American, right? So this is a baseline. It's an imperfect baseline, but it's a baseline. But I think when we think about managing for late successional management, I think it's important to contextualize those desired late successional old growth conditions that we're trying to manage for at landscape scales based on what's appropriate based on the NRV modeling for that ecozone in that landscape. And so, late successional and old growth, the NRV models show was pretty common in a lot of ecozones, especially more mesic ecozones like acidic and rich coves. It was actually less common in some of our more disturbance frequent fire adapted forest communities such as dry oak and shortleaf pine oak, where you had a higher proportion of young and open and actually a lower proportion of some of those late and old growth conditions. And so this is the problem, right? It's a beautiful forest landscape that we have in the Southern Appalachians, but this is what we refer to from a wildlife habitat perspective as a sea of sameness. The uniformly single-aged closed canopy conditions of a lot of our current Southern Appalachian forest landscape is simply not providing the habitat diversity that a broad suite of at-risk wildlife species need. And so when you look at kind of age class distribution across the landscape, this is just a sample of all of our national forests in the Southern Appalachians, but across what is literally millions of acres of public lands here in the Southern Appalachians, there's currently only 1.3% young forest, and the vast majority of the forests are second growth and about 80 to 120 years old. And so this is pretty consistent with some of the other slides we saw from other presenters, but it's no surprise when you have a landscape that's dominated by closed canopy forests that are middle-aged to mature, that species which require more young forest conditions, as well as species which require more late successional forest conditions, are all declining, and they're all declining at alarming rates. But it's not just forest structure in terms of age class diversity, it's also percent openness. About 50% of our ecological zones or forest types here in the Southern Apps are considered fire adapted. And historically, we know conditions were a lot more open with a higher percentage of woodlands and savannas and grasslands. And so species which require greater herbaceous cover and more open canopy conditions that are more fire driven are also declining across the landscape as well. So this is our challenge and our opportunity. It's to take forests that are currently dominated by single age closed canopy systems, where there's usually an underrepresentation of young forest, open forest, and late successional forest, both from an NRV ecological perspective and from just a pure wildlife habitat perspective. And through conservation planning and through active forest management, increase those proportions of underrepresented habitat to promote more healthy forests and abundant wildlife. And so, one of the primary ways that we have been doing that at the Ruffed Grouse Society is through dynamic forest restoration blocks, or DFRBs. So you've already heard other presenters talk about DFRBs. It's not a framework that we invented. It is a framework that we have been utilizing as our focal area approach and our primary landscape implementation approach. To me, some of the core components of how we think about DFRBs is managing at landscape scales, greater than 1,000 acre blocks, usually in that 30 to 50,000 acre kind of watershed scale, centered on public lands, but also perhaps including private lands within its scope. Planning to assess current conditions and establish desired conditions, and also cover typing in terms of allocating the focal area into different management zones to help guide and inform management. Implementation to achieve desired conditions within that block, and then monitoring to assess both wildlife and vegetative response to our implementation to help inform management, be adaptive, and test our hypotheses. And I think the underlying part of this framework that's really interesting to me is that we need a landscape implementation unit that is both large enough that achieving desired conditions at that scale will have a biologically significant impact on the wildlife species that we're trying to benefit, but also small enough that we can actually achieve those desired conditions under a relatively short time frame, and small enough that we can effectively monitor the impacts of our work. And so we have been very actively trying to move away from random acts of conservation on the landscape, small scale, boutique, single species habitat projects, and really trying to move holistically to managing and restoring functional landscape blocks. And the DFRB framework is a really good way to do that. We've also been strategically working to develop new DFRBs here in the Southern Appalachians, tiered to existing conservation planning efforts. So rather than reinventing any planning wheels, we've been working closely with our partners at the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture to develop DFRBs that are tiered to their focal landscapes, as well as working with partners at NRCS to develop them within kind of golden-winged warbler focal areas established within the Working Lands for Wildlife program. Another more recent partnership that we have is with the Nature Conservancy, where we've been intentionally working to identify both active dynamic forest blocks and also propose DFRBs that align with TNC's resilient and connected network and the focal landscapes within it. And I think the DFRB framework can provide a really useful way to help operationalize and implement the restoration activities to achieve those NRV thresholds within those RCN networks as well. And so here's just an example of some of the way some of that looks like spatially. So this is the Cumberland's focal landscape from the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture. These are two DFRBs that we helped fund and create through a NIFWIF Cumberlands grant. The DFRBs themselves are focused on public lands. They're anchored on state lands, which is really where we focused the planning, implementation, and monitoring. But we also applied private landowner outreach buffers to those public lands. So a primary buffer of 10 miles, a secondary buffer of 25, and a tertiary buffer of 50 to really focus and triage some of the private landowner outreach and private landowner technical and financial assistance that we are providing within these landscapes, with the idea of being able to radiate out habitat conditions beyond the DFRBs into private landowners and the surrounding landscapes, and ultimately, ideally, help expand population densities across that landscape too. And so, Sean and Britt got into this a bit during their presentation, but I'm kind of with a triangle starting big and getting pointed. So I did want to provide a little more detail about the kind of stand level prescription that we've been working on within this DFRB at Catoosa. And so basically we've been working to accelerate structural complexity to move the stand more towards late successional characteristics through a variable density thinning. So the desired conditions that we established for this stand at Catoosa was informed by land fires, biophysical setting for Allegheny, Cumberland, dry forest, and woodland. And we were very specific in working with TNC and working with TWRA to think about what seral condition within that biophysical setting are we really trying to manage for within this stand. And ultimately, we landed on Class D, which is the late seral closed canopy oak hickory forest. And so that's our target. That's where we are trying to move this stand. And so the prescription that we developed was a variable density thinning with gaps, skips, and matrix. And so those gap areas are those canopy gaps where we're creating 10th to quarter acre sized gaps across 5 to 10% of the stand. The skips are 10th to half acre sized areas that make up 5 to 15% of the stand where we will be doing nothing. And then we're doing a mid-story removal treatment in the matrix between gaps and skips to promote advanced oak regeneration. And we're also doing prop tree release within pre-existing gaps where there's quality prop trees, oaks and hickories that are ready for release. And we're also thinking about kind of a longer fire return interval, 15 to 25 years as a follow-up treatment to the mechanical and herbicide. One thing that I'll share that is maybe a complement to what Britt and Sean already shared is to operationalize this on the ground. We had to think about what are our criteria when we identify and lay out gaps and skips as part of that variable density thinning. And so these are some of the kind of metrics that we landed on. We wanted to center gaps in areas that had existing advanced oak regeneration that were ready for release, where there were already gaps created that looked pretty good that we could expand, where there was an overstory of uncharacteristic trees, where the goal was more to set back those uncharacteristic trees, remove them, or where we had an overstory that had trees with poor form or degradation, and also prioritizing gaps on drier sites that were more south and west aspects. When we thought about skips, places that we would not be doing anything, we wanted to identify areas in the stand that had uncommon or underrepresented trees and rare plants. Where there were existing gaps, where desired trees were competing well and we could just leave them alone. Where there was an abundance of biological legacies, an abundance of dead wood, an abundance of mass-producing trees, unique landscape features like tip-up mounds, perennial and intermittent streams, obviously SMZs, and then some of our more mesic microsites on that north and east-facing aspects. So these are all kind of locations, microsites across the stand where we said, at least one of these criteria should be met to identify this area as a gap or a skip. And that's how we've been moving forward with laying out that treatment on the ground. Yeah, just a couple last things. I think all of this work, especially when we're talking about doing non-commercial late successional management work, needs funding. especially standing up, DFRBs and doing all the planning, implementation, and monitoring within them. So we wouldn't be able to do any of this work without partners. And I think, there are funding sources and partnerships that are out there, whether it's through competitive grant programs like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation programs, Forest Services landscape scale restoration program, or partner agreements. There's different ways that we can work together to leverage external funding and leverage capacity to be able to get the work done. And ultimately, that's how we've been able to be successful, is by working with partners and leveraging resources. So that's all I have. With that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Sean.
All right, thanks, Nick. We're doing a little musical chairs here. Yeah, so just wanted to quickly touch on an example of one of the NIFWIF grants that we're using for a dynamic forest restoration block in Southwest Virginia. So this DFRB is focused on Clinch Mountain Wildlife Management Area, Hidden Valley Wildlife Management Area, and Channel State Forest down in Southwest Virginia, as you can see in the corner of the state there. And we've been working with the Department of Forestry, Department of Wildlife Resources, and several partners to implement this work. Essentially, what we're trying to do is focus on those public land anchors that I just discussed, but we also have private land buffers that Nick mentioned previously. So we're doing private land outreach to try to create more cohesive blocks that we can work, plan, and implement work in hopes of creating more young, open, and late successional conditions. We're also doing baseline monitoring of vegetative conditions, and we're using eBird status and trends data products to collect baseline relative abundance of our focal wildlife species in that area. And we're also, a unique part of this project is we're doing a carbon outcomes analysis. So with that, we're partnering with Terra Carbon, and what they've done is they've tried to model out optimized carbon mitigation levels on the landscape, and then also optimized wildlife habitat, and then finding an equilibrium point of how can we optimize for both. So that's sort of an interesting component of this project as we think about our climate goals balanced with wildlife habitat. Also, as part of this, we want to pilot late successional treatment. So we're excited that this workshop is one component of that. And then finally, we are going to be using the Working Lands for Wildlife program to write forest management plans and connect private landowners to financial assistance. And when we're looking at this project and our focal species, so we've got the golden winged warbler, which is more of our early successional obligate. We've got our cerulean warbler, which is more of our late successional obligate. And then the wood thrush, which is more of our mature forest obligate. We're trying to improve habitat by about 133 acres for each species. And then at a higher level, these are some more of our conservation metrics. So I'll just give you a couple seconds to look that over, but just at a high level, this is what we're trying to accomplish on the landscape. And so as we're here today talking more about late successional old forest characteristics, old growth characteristics, wanted to just highlight one of the treatments we are doing on Clinch Mountain WMA. This is specifically going to be focused on accelerating the development of structural complexity. So looking at more of a younger to middle age stand and trying to accelerate conditions that could lead to old growth characteristics later on. To do that, we want to move that stand to a more diverse and mature stand by creating more within stand structural heterogeneity. We're going to be doing a crop tree release specifically to promote valuable tree species in that 20 to 30 year range, and try to do so through gap creation and spacing that satisfies a basal area of greater than 90 square feet per acre. We're going to be leaving snags. And I think we're doing this keeping in mind best management practices for wood thrush. So managing more for our mature forest obligate here. And in those best management practices by Lambert, he outlines in pole size stands, you want to accelerate the development of high vigorous canopy with light or variable density thinning, crop tree release, or crop tree release with canopy gap formation. And this table here below is also pulled from those BMPs. And so I think it's a good sort of visual of how you can work with a starting condition and move that toward a desired condition, working in both mature stands and then sort of your younger to middle-aged stands. As another part of this project, we're going to have demonstration areas for each of our focal wildlife species. So trying to focus on about 50 acres. So 50 acres for golden wing warbler, 50 acres for cerulean warbler, 50 acres for wood thrush. And we will do this at Clinch Mountain and Channel State Forest. And what we want to do actually as a follow-up to this workshop, and hopefully some of you can attend, is have some field days where we can discuss these demonstration areas, and we can also discuss piloting late successional treatments in these areas. So I'm sure I'll send out an email following up with this workshop, but we would love to do sort of a in-person on the ground field day this summer where we can talk about these different types of management strategies and what that might look like on the ground. So in terms of managing into the future, we talked about this a little bit in our breakout groups. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to manage for late successional conditions. As some of you know, as some of you work for the Forest Service, the National Old Growth Amendment has gotten a lot of attention, which essentially is going to modify the 128 National Forest Land Management Plans. There's been a public scoping and comment period, which we've been involved with, and they're expecting a record of decision to be signed in early 2025. And as part of this, all projects in old growth areas must go through a review process by the deputy chief. And it seems like at the moment, there's not a ton of consensus on how this is going to be interpreted at the forest level. But I think what we've determined is, one, it's a great opportunity to be open to this type of management, and it's top of mind for the Forest Service. At the same time, and through the comment period, we've been trying to be vocal that we are still a fan of sustainable forest management. And we worry that something like this could potentially put an emphasis on old forest over a number of other critical successional stages. So not to say this isn't important, we just don't want to weigh this more than the others, which I think we've talked about today in various presentations. We do want to take that holistic approach that we've discussed and move the landscape more toward these levels that Nick mentioned earlier on to create more young, open, and late successional conditions. I guess finally, just want to say that for this project in Southwest Virginia and for many others, and a lot of folks have echoed this today, but it wouldn't be possible without our partners. So AMJV and the Nature Conservancy have been instrumental not only in planning this workshop, but also with a number of other facets of this project, and also the Department of Wildlife Resources, the Department of Forestry, NWTF, and Quail Forever, some other conservation partners involved, and then Terra Carbon, who's been doing that carbon and wildlife monitoring, assessment. So that's about it for us. I think we just thank everyone for being here today. Obviously, it's probably interesting for us to be on this call for some folks, as I think grouse are always attributed with those early successional conditions, which we definitely still advocate for. But also, we want this holistic approach where we can create more diverse, structurally complex forests that benefit a suite of wildlife species. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, any questions? We have time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got time for questions. Feel free to come off mute or put your questions in the chat, and Sean and Nick will field them.
You can see the chat.
This is Shane Jones. I work for the Forest Service in West Virginia, and I put it in the chat, but I just want to verbalize my chat. Great presentation. I really appreciate your guys' holistic approach. And I've been with the Forest Service for a long time in West Virginia and seeing the transition from a critter club and focusing on young forest habitat to thinking about a working forest. I mean, you're right. For you guys to be here talking at an old forest or late successional habitat webinar is pretty cool. And it's partners like you all that we're really interested in working with into the future. And also liked towards the end, you gave that reference talking about demonstration areas for some different species. You know, communicating that message to not only other practitioners, but to the public is such a big deal. So good stuff, and would be interested in talking more how we could get you up north just a little bit more. I mean, we work close with Ben Larson, but we just all get busy with stuff. But just wanted to offer my appreciation for your presentation. It was really inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words, Shane. And yeah, we definitely care about those young forests too, and we definitely recognize there's an ecological habitat need for a lot more young forests than is currently on the landscape. But there's also a big need for more late successional and open as well. So yeah, appreciate that. And yeah, we're definitely trying to take a broader holistic approach to restoring landscapes. So thanks, Shane.
And not telling non-government folks what to do, but your comments on the National Old Growth Amendment are not ignored and very spot on, because it doesn't just say we don't like old growth. It talks about the bigger picture and the importance of having to have the ability to manage in the name of conservation. So keep up the good work.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
Shane.
Yeah, any other questions? Chat.
Yeah, I think that's it. All right, I think that's all. So yeah, we will kick it over to Will.
Yeah, thanks, Nick and Sean, for closing us out there. And thank all of you for giving so much of your time, 4 hours to talk about late successional forest management. If I didn't say it up front, I'll say it now. I think this is just the start for many of us in learning about this and implementing it and trying to push it to scale. So be on the lookout for an email, likely from Amanda or I, with a recorded version of this webinar, and please share it with your colleagues who weren't able to attend, or those that you think would benefit from it, as we try and spread the good word and get more people thinking about this. The more people thinking about it with unique perspectives, working in unique forest types, hopefully the better we can get it dialed in and start to implement this, and then hopefully grow it. So thank you all again for spending a very solid chunk of your Wednesday morning with us. Like Amanda just put in the chat, if you're interested in continuing education credits, please reach out to her and she can set you up with that.